everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
Tensura Reborn as the first Nephilim, Chapter 31-40, Chapter 29. It was now the day they'd been preparing for, the day when the troll horde would take the after Lucian came back and reported what he found, and the new threat level of the trolls. They had been preparing for the worst. That had been roughly 3 days ago, the trolls taking longer to reach their position due to their increased load in the form of armaments. This let them stock up on more swords and potions, though that blessing felt like a far worse end of the deal when in exchange for that time their enemy was now greatly more threatening. The men used this time wisely though. After finishing up their fortifications, the soldiers began to dig pit traps and other such things to hamper the enemy as much as they could. Didn't think any of the monsters would die from them, but it would impede their movement and make hitting them all the easier. That on its own was worth it. Now they waited with bated breath as the trolls crested the horizon and came into view. Horde was not a sight one ever wished to see, monsters that even at their shortest towered over the men, and wielding weapons larger than a grown man in some cases. If one were to compare a foot soldier from their side, and one of the humans, it would be no surprise who would come out on top. Yet the men hardened themselves and stood at attention, ready to face the horde with all they had. The majority of the men stood out in front of the fortification and stood waiting for orders. Was among their number that Lucian and his group, as well as Shirzwa and Bulat, were waiting to enact the plan. Behind the wooden wall was Richard, who more so stood atop it than behind it so as to give orders. Also a small troop of pre-designated medics and supply runners were ready for heading out at a moment's notice behind the wall. These men had been given instruction from Alice and Blake on how to properly administer the healing supplies and weapons, respectively. They all knew that such men were likely to be soaked in more blood than any frontliner, and for that all that fought were grateful. They just hoped blood would be all they lost that day. They waited for a while longer, watching as the trolls marched onwards towards them. Once they were close enough that Richard shouted out an order. "Now Alice," he yelled, and the black-haired mage strode forth to the front of the men. Once she got into position, she raised her hand forth and summoned forth her manipulation skill. This skill did more than grant power over darkness and curses, it also allowed her to affect one's mind. She was not overly familiar with doing so yet, but this application would be within her power. Suddenly, a wave of reddish energy came forth from her hand and seeped into all the trolls leading the charge. She shouted out, and all the monsters that had gained the red hue grew angrier and charged forth recklessly. Alice smirked as she went back among the soldiers, watching on as the trolls ran forward with no care or consideration for where they stepped. Then, just as planned, they fell one by one into the traps dug out by the men. Once Richard was certain from his higher point of view, he gave the next order. Was all that came from the young commander's mouth, and yet it was answered with the roar of all his men. A shout to scare their enemies just as much as it was one to rally their own courage. The roar of men prepared to die. The men ran forth, Lucian and the others among them, and crashed into the trolls that had evaded the traps by some stroke of luck. Lucian led a small group of men, the others in his party doing the same, and came face to face with one of the trolls. In a blur of speed, Lucian drew Graham from its place in his storage and sliced the beast's head clean off. To his surprise, the monster picked up its own head and reattached it as if none the worse for wear. Notice, it appears that all of the trolls are in possession of the extra skill version of self-regeneration that is markedly superior to the common skill of the same name, Puriel. Informed him after that sight. Just great, it couldn't be the easier one, could it? He asked aloud rhetorically before coating Graham in flames. Now with his flaming sword he once more cut into the troll before him. The swing of his sword cut off the arm of the troll this time, and Lucian dodged out of the way of the remaining arm's swing. He looked on as the stump where the beast's arm used to be attached burned in flames, and thus stopped the regeneration. That made him smirk. Using yang manipulation to enhance his body, Lucian blurred forward and cut the beast's head clean off once more. This time the troll dropped dead, never to rise again. Once that was done and he received the troll's soul, he gave an order to Puriel. Analyze the troll's soul and determine methods of killing them that the soldiers could accomplish, he told the ultimate skill. It didn't take long for Puriel to devise such a thing, only about 3 minutes to run the calculations. During that time Lucian protected the group of men he was given, as they did their best to hold off the trolls. Blake was cutting down trolls to his left somewhere, though they got back up 9 times out of 10. Alfred, Schurzwa and Bullet weren't doing much better, the first 2 punching the trolls down more than anything. Alice was being the most effective this time, launching controlled fire spells at the trolls in the distance after seeing her sire's own flames be so effective. Then, Puriel finally gave him the answer he needed. It has been determined that there are 2 methods that can result in the elimination of the trolls. First, to damage them repeatedly until they run out of magicules. The second and more effective method is to cause massive damage to the head and brain. Puriel told. Lucian smirked once again, glad to have confirmation on that. He thought such a strategy would be what was needed, but with the presence of the troll general he didn't wish to possibly give false information. As the old saying goes, no information is better than faulty information. Now he knew that directing the men to go for the heads with all they got wouldn't just get them killed. Using thought communication that he got from killing dire wolves, he informed his team, and they all were expecting it, and thus wouldn't be at risk of making a mistake in battle from hearing it, unlike the men who might panic. After relaying that information, almost all as one, they all shouted out for their men to hear. Aim for the head. Blake looked on as the battle raged. The bloodshed had been going on for some time, about half an hour if his sense of time was right, though it felt far longer. He was glad to see that due to their preparations they hadn't lost too much from what he could see. Only about 20 of their men were dead if he were to guess, while over 5 times that number were now gone from their foes. Though there were plenty of men that while alive were no longer in fighting shape, and would require Alice's skills to be back into proper shape again. He himself had killed over 10 trolls, though, most of his time being taken up by ensuring the men he led were staying alive. If not for all these men, Blake thought that perhaps he, and the party led by Lucian, could have taken care of these monsters by now. However, he knew that was short-sighted of him. The men were needed for the second phase of the plan after all. Was as he was thinking this and using Star Crash to cave a troll's skull in that he saw what he'd been waiting for. The troll commanders had taken the field. Hold fast, men. The second phase is now in motion. Keep those bastards off of us while me and the others go show those lanky sons of bitches why they should have never crawled out of their caves. He shouted to his men and got a rallying cry back from them. Blake took off towards the nearest of the 5 commanders to him and smiled at the cheer. His something in him had been awoken when leading those men, something he never expected of himself. He enjoyed giving orders to his men, and he relished in leading them to each troll his men slayed. Made a spark of pride grow in his chest, not for himself but for those he led. It was a feeling that made him feel alive, like when he exchanged blades with a worthy foe. Perhaps that was what inspired him to give that declaration that was unlike, or, more likely, seeing as a troll ate the severed arm of one of his men ignited a wrath in him he hadn't seen in some time. That was a major part of it, he thought. Reaching the commander, a troll that stood near 15 feet tall in comparison to the 10 feet tall normal trolls, and wielding what looked to be an uprooted tree in its right hand, Blake charged the monster. Using swift style he increased his speed, and decreased his personal gravity to propel himself at the beast's neck. To his surprise, though, the monster moved incredibly fast as well, and grabbed Blake's longsword in its large left hand. Blake let go of his blade just as he registered this, and was glad he did so, as the next instant saw the commander smash his arm into the ground with great force. At the sight of the monster's blow was now a crater several feet in diameter, and a broken blade in its center. Blake sweated a bit at the sight, not liking how easily the monster destroyed his blade. How close he came to being in that crater as well. Putting on a rough grin, Blake used magic sword manifestation, and made a sword imbued with the fire element. Pushing his magicules into the blade, flames erupted from his longsword, his way of mimicking Shizu's style of swordsmanship. He may not be the conqueror of flames like her, but he'd prove himself strong enough to kill this monster before. My flames may not be as strong, so I'll simply compress them into a burning star instead. He shouted out as he poured more and more magicules into his sword. Then, as the flames grew in size, he created a gravity field around the blade to compress the. As the fire grew stronger and more numerous, Blake increased the gravity around his sword, all the while moving to dodge around the commander's swings with its makeshift. Finally though, the pressure and flames grew to his desired level, and the fire turned blazing blue. With a shout he charged headlong at the monster, his rage at the monster's actions fueling his strike. Supernova slash. In but an instant Blake found himself behind the troll, the flames of his sword gone, and the blade itself cracked like glass. He breathed heavily as he turned to face the troll once more before seeing the monster fall into two. He'd cut the monster down the middle, a perfect bifurcation, and watched as not even a drop of blood came from the massive wound. Cross-section in the troll commander's body was seared closed on both sides due to the immense heat of Blake's blade, it seemed. Blake himself felt exhausted after pulling off that move, not wishing to risk this monster living for any longer than absolutely necessary. No, with the regeneration ability of the normal trolls, he didn't wish to test this monster's own. Memories of some of the legends Lucian told him of made him wary of such a thing. Now to see if the others are doing okay, the teen said as he got up and walked towards the nearest battleground. Alfred was not having a good time. Don't get him wrong, he loved to fight. However, as he saw the men he was put in charge of getting injured beyond the healing potion's ability to heal, or outright be killed, it made him wish for this to end already. So when the commanders made their appearance, he leapt to the opportunity to end this after telling his men what was to happen. It seemed his new friend was of a similar mind as Shirzwa met him en route to the big bastard. You ready to pound this guy into a pulp? Alfred asked his friend, neither of them breaking their stride. The blond man gave him a smirk and a nod as they charged at the monster. This one was just as tall as the other commanders and wielded a boulder that it had somehow embedded its hand into, using it like a gauntlet or a glove. The two brawlers circled the thing and landed what blows they could, distracting it from hitting the other when they saw it wind up its fist. As they hammered the beast, they saw as their attacks barely did a thing. Alfred had felt a rib break under his fist, and then saw as it healed back into shape, all as the troll didn't so much as it was seeing that Alfred pieced together that this monster likely had some form of pain resistance, or maybe even outright nullification. That wouldn't do them any favors. Now not only will the monster heal over from their attacks, but not even be slowed down from. Alfred made some distance between him and the troll, Shirzwa meeting up with him as they looked on at the troll, fresh as it was before their blows. You got any ideas there, bud? Because I don't think I'm going to be able to do enough damage soon enough, the white-haired demon said. That was true, even with his gladiator skill increasing his strength as time went on. It wasn't in order to deal enough damage to completely destroy this thing he'd need to fight for another hour or so. That wasn't something they could do. Luckily, it seemed his blonde companion had an idea. I've got a move I've been practicing that might just put this guy down. I need you to distract him though as I focus, he said, and Alfred nodded before launching himself at the monster. As Alfred distracted the beast, Shirzwa focused on his unique skill, Enforcer. Specifically on its ability Force Control. He'd been practicing with Bullet on this for some time, and now was the time to use it. By focusing all the force he could unleash into smaller and smaller surface area, he increased its piercing ability, similar to a bullet. This took intense focus though and immense control over his own power. But this world has given me what I always wanted, control of myself, he thought with a smirk on his face. Releasing a scream from his chest, Shirzwa charged at the commander, Alfred hurriedly moving out of the way. The blond man jumped up and reached eye level with the monster. And before the dim-witted beast even had a moment to register him, Shirzwa threw his punch. At the moment of impact, a massive shock wave was unleashed as all the kinetic force of his punch, something that could shear through steel already, was compressed into the area of the world seemed to freeze for a second before the troll's head burst. Once Shurzwa landed, he looked on at the now headless body of the troll commander, its ugly face nowhere to be seen, as it was obliterated upon impact. The tall man sighed before collapsing onto the ground in exhaustion. After a moment of rest, he heard a thump next to him. It was Alfred, who had fallen onto his back to lay beside him. They just laid there for a while, catching their breath. White-haired man held out a closed fist to Shurzwa. The blonde saw it and, after a moment of consideration, held out his own fist to bump against his new friend's. Before the two of them, Surtur was breathing heavily. Having been fighting against this troll commander for a while, he had been taking blow after blow from the beast, Surtur having grown to his true size to match the large beast. It seemed that in terms of physical strength they were matched. Giant was holding back, however, by not using his lava abilities, not trusting the heat of it to not harm his allies. That was his major weakness after all. Despite his lava's strength, it was unusable when near allies. So he'd been doing the role he best served as. He would hold off this monster until it tired itself out or another could end its life. It seemed though that the latter was what was to occur, as the human otherworlder Bullet charged forth to aid him. The man was clad in white draconic armor, and was wielding a summoned spear made from the same material. With a yell, the bulky man stabbed his spear forth and pierced right through the monster's leg, pinning the monster to the ground. After that, Bullet jumped back and motioned for Surtur to do the same. Once some distance had been made between them, Bullet shouted up at him. Surtur, seeing as the troll struggled in its attempt to pull the spear, "Throw me," was what the man said as he summoned forth another spear. It took Surtur a second to process the man's request, and a moment more to understand what he was planning. But the giant nodded and picked the human up before assuming what his lord would call a pitcher's stance. "You ready?" he asked the either very brave or very stupid human in his hands. "Let's end this, mother," Bullet shouted out with the kind of confidence only the strong and the crazy had. Surtur huffed a laugh before throwing the man at the troll's head just as the monster was about to free itself. Bullet screamed as he put his spear in front of his body and focused on pushing all his power into the weapon. This resulted in the previous spear that had pinned the monster down unsummoned, but he didn't care. No, what he cared about was seeing his spear increase in size till its head dwarfed the troll's own skull. Pushing his all into his spear, Bullet was launched clean through the monster's head and into the ground behind it. Just like that, they had defeated the commander. Surtur watched on as the giant spear that looked more like a weapon for one of his own stature than the human who wielded it disappeared. As he waited on for the men to rise and didn't see it, the giant started to grow worried. That was until he heard laughing. "Ha ha, let's do that again sometime, big guy. Though preferably after the world stops spinning," ugh, the man said with a groan at the end. Surtur could only chuckle at this crazy human's boldness. I guess he'd be both brave and stupid, he thought with a chuckle before moving to aid. The Alice stood before the second-to-last troll commander. She hadn't been sitting idle, no, she'd been preparing a spell of her own. This spell would ensure this troll's eradication, but the calculations to limit collateral damage were taking longer than expected. It wouldn't do to have the men she led burn to a crisp after all. But finally, it was finished. Alice raised her hand forth, and binding chains of shadows wrapped around her target. Troll roared out in agitation at her bindings, but Alice ignored it. Instead, she focused her magical power beneath the ugly behemoth, and formed a glowing red spell circle. This circle had various spinning symbols all throughout it, and soon spawned 7 smaller circles around it, orbiting it like a star. Throughout this whole process, she had closed her eyes, but now she opened them wide. Irises glowed scarlet as she smirked like a mad scientist before their latest experiment. Scarlet incineration. Once the spell's name left her mouth, even without the enhancing chant, a plume of red flames burned forth that was so hot the dirt turned to slag around the circle. The monster didn't even have time to cry out in pain, as it was turned to ashes. The black-haired witch looked on and placed a hand to her chin. "That was a bit weaker than I wanted it to be, oh well," she said aloud to herself. The men she had led that were close enough to hear that felt incredulous at that comment. from their temporary leader. None of them said a thing until one young soldier spoke up with a sentiment that they all agreed with. "Remind me to never piss her off," was all the soldier said to approving noises from his. Alice just smirked at the man's words and looked on at the final battleground. "It's all up to you now, sire, though I'll make sure to play my part to perfection," she thought to herself as she turned around to head back to the wooden wall. She had men to heal now that this was almost over. That and an old mage to curse. Edited, January 28, 2026. Chapter 32. Chapter 30. Lucian stood before the troll commander he'd picked as his target, staring with a cold look of indifference on his face. He had led his small group of men well, and had since left them to handle the normal trolls. This would let him focus on the commander, and after that the commander he'd chosen wasn't too different than the others, it was merely the one closest to him. So, with focus put into his hand, he summoned forth powerful flames using essence of flame. These flames burned a sickly black, which Lucian thought was fitting. These flames were made to burn not only the body of his foe, but the very ability to heal as well. In essence, these flames were his counter to regeneration abilities that he thought up when contemplating how to counter the troll's healing abilities. It was only a shame that they took quite a bit of his magicules to make and maintain, as well as a lot of focus to ensure they didn't go out of control on him. As the large monster roared and charged at him, Lucian simply threw the ball of black flame at the beast. Once it made contact with the troll, it covered the thing's form quickly. The putrid black flames seemed to become a second skin around it and began to eat away at its flesh. The commander screamed out in pain, stopping in their tracks as the flames turned them slowly to ash. First its dark green skin, then the pink muscles underneath. In but a few minutes all that was left was blackened bones and the sounds of the ongoing battle, the monster's screams being burned away like the rest of him. Lucian then cancelled his flames out and breathed out from the strain of keeping the flames under control. Those flames were far too strong for his current self and required his entire focus to keep from spreading out. If he had even so much as moved, he would have lost control, and they would have devoured all here. Should that have happened, then all that lived would have become fuel for it, and even should it be put out, life would never return to the land. It would have sundered. "Well," Lucian said with a bit of tiredness in his voice, "I can't use that against the general." It was true, because if he tried to use such flames against the general, there was a good possibility of him losing control if he needed to move. Something he'd need to do in order to dodge an attack from the monster, as it was highly likely even when on fire that beast would still try and kill him. The possible devastation was too great to risk. With that in mind, Lucian watched on at the rest of the battle, seeing his allies take down the other commanders one by one. He also saw as most of them become far more tired than expected from those encounters, Alice being the only one not to look winded. He couldn't call on her for help though. With the general, she had a far more important role: limiting the casualties of their men and cursing that bastard court mage. No, he would need to take on the general by himself. Speaking of which, Lucian finally spotted the general now. The towering, 20-foot-tall, colossal of green muscle roared out as the last of its commanders fell dead. Stomping forward from its place at the tree line, the troll general marched onto the battlefield with anger in his eyes, and did something Lucian wasn't expecting. He shouted out in frustration. "You take down my men, you puny men. Food shouldn't be so strong." The troll spoke with low intelligence, but with more than enough wrath to make up for it. Lucian was a bit caught off guard. Trolls weren't known to be capable of speech after all. Though soon enough he shook it off, realizing that the increased intellect from evolution had seemingly been enough to allow him of that ability now. That wasn't uncommon to see in monsters, just a bit unusual for this species due to their lack of intellect being a defining trait. It didn't matter though, the monster before him was still going to die. "That's because we're not your food, you big lug," Lucian shouted out to the troll and gripped Graham tightly in his hands. The general looked right at Lucian and seemed to take a measure of him. "You're not supposed to fight back this good. I'll kill you good and dead to make sure none like you exist." He shouted and charged at Lucian, a large sword raised high above him. Lucian moved out of the way, and saw that where had just been standing was turned into a large crater from the impact. Holding Graham steady, he then launched himself at the tall monster, while he was trying to get his sword out from the earth. It seemed though that the troll was perceptive as he dodged out of the way of Lucian's strike, only losing an arm instead of the head that he'd intended to take. Jumping away, the general made some distance between them, seemingly unconcerned about his missing arm. Lucian understood why in a moment as the troll regenerated its arm in a matter of seconds. Notice, it appears that the one known as the Troll General is in possession of the extra skill Ultra Speed Regeneration, the far superior version of self-regeneration Puriel. Informed him as he stared in awe at the speed at which his foe healed. That's faster than even I can regenerate. It'd be one thing if he simply reattached his arm, but to grow one from scratch so quickly is something else, he thought as he grew cautious once seeing the fallen arm of his enemy. Though he blitzed towards it, the troll took that moment to get its sword free. Once Lucian reached the severed arm, he activated the absorption skill. On taking the arm into himself, he tasked Puriel with analyzing the arm of his foe, hoping for all the information he could get. The monster wouldn't let him sit around and wait for his skill to complete the process though, and charged at him once more. Lucian blocked the heavy blows of the troll with Graham, feeling the strain on even his strong body from the force behind them. Each swing of the troll's sword had the force equivalent to one of Blake's gravity-enhanced blows, while also being even faster than the teen in delivering them one after the other. Objectively, the monster wasn't a skilled swordsman, but he didn't need to be with his raw strength. Every now and again Lucian would land a blow on the beast, only to see the wound heal over before his sword even fully left the monster's flesh. It was frustrating, and so he decided to cover Graham in flames to aid in his efforts. This only seemed to slow down the general's regeneration a bit, now allowing his blade to leave its body before the wounds closed. Himself was also taking the occasional cut or two and healing from them in kind. Exchange of cuts and swipes drew blood from the two's bodies and painted the ground around them in a brutal and macabre mural of crimson. The Nephilim fought back, trying to buy time so his ultimate skill could give him the information he needed. But he knew this was getting him nowhere with having to focus on fighting the monster before him, slowing down the process. The magicules he needed to spend on increasing the processing speed of Puriel were instead being used via yang manipulation to increase his own body's strength and durability for this fight. So he was incredibly happy to hear that detestable mage from the kingdom call out at that moment. Lucian smirked and disengaged from his fight as the mage called out for him to leave the troll to him. He looked on at the mage's glazed eyes before using the distraction to the fullest. Thanks, Alice, he thought as he moved away for the time being. Alice sighed as she patched up another wounded soldier with her magic. This one had gotten their leg cut off, though luckily the leg had been recovered with him. That allowed her to heal him more easily, simply reattaching the leg instead of needing to try and grow it back. Wasn't even something she was sure she could do yet, and it slightly annoyed her. That was the damn holy magic and its judgy god, she muttered to herself in frustration as she moved on to the next injured man. She had tried to learn the holy magic of the Holy Church but failed at every turn, their god seeming unresponsive to her attempts. Perhaps it was because she didn't believe in this so-called god of theirs. For her there was only one being she fully believed in, and that was her. She didn't worship him or anything, not like those followers she'd seen kneeling and begging for power at the church. No, she simply believed that her sire held power and wisdom, and was deserving of respect. She paused to consider if that was the problem, not that she didn't believe in the God of the Holy Church, but that she didn't respect them. Alice thought that the God they prayed to was real, though more so as a living being than some ephemeral being, but she didn't respect them in the least. How could she when that same God's followers and main teachings spoke of her kind as pure evil? When it was in part due to them that she couldn't exist as herself. Among the shaking her head, she focused once more on healing all those she could. Soon enough though, she looked out at the battlefield and saw her sire fighting the troll general. It looked like her sire was buying time, for what she wasn't certain, but she knew it had to be for a good reason. Thus, she decided to put the plan into action now in order to give him more time. Around the camp Alice spotted the mage that held the chains of Shurzwa and Bulat, and she had been instructed to curse the men during the battle when she thought it best. That time she decided, and so she focused on manipulation. Hiding her magic as best she could, more than sufficient to keep the not too magically powerful army from noticing, she latched her magic onto the mun. In but a moment Alice was weaving her curse, whispering temptations into his mind. Soon, in a voice he thought to be his own, the mage heard in his mind encouraging words. Whispers telling him of the glory and power he could gain from going out there and defeating this monster himself. Of how the king would reward him, of how mages from across the world would come to him for knowledge and give him the respect he was owed. Was far stronger than some upstart commoner, and thus could easily take down this beast. It was all a bunch of nonsense, but Alice knew he'd buy it. Not only was he the kind of man to have such thoughts already, but with her curse fanning the flames of his ambition and lowering his inhibitions, he was doomed to fall to the sway of such tempting words. Wasn't surprised in the least when the elderly mage walked forward and went towards Commander Richard. He said the title like it was a stain more than a badge of honor. I shall take the field now and put an end to this farce. Richard looked at the man in shock at first, never knowing the cowardly mage was willing to do such a thing. But soon enough the man came to a realization. He didn't particularly care why the mage was wanting to do this. If anything, he was happy at those words and was more than willing to let the man go and do so. Not because he thought the mage could win, gods, it was for one reason, and one reason only. Then I wish you luck, sir, he said with a pasted-on false smile, watching on as the old man said he didn't need luck, and went out onto the battlefield. It seems though that luck is on my side today, though, old man. I hope your death is at least quick, if for no other reason than to see my friends free all the faster, Richard thought, knowing there was no way the mage would win against the general. Now, it was only a matter of watching as the man in part responsible for his friend's enslavement died. Hopefully, Lucian can kill that general afterwards, then that would truly make this day a complete victory in his eyes. Lucian watched on as the mage fired blasts of elemental magic at the troll, more annoying than anything. The mage used short burst spatial magic to keep his distance from the general, but the Nephilim knew it was just a matter of time until the monster killed the mun. Decided to use this time to the fullest and focused all his power on increasing Puriel's abilities. In but a few moments, perhaps 2 or so minutes, his skill chimed in once more. Analysis of the troll general has been completed. It has been determined that the troll general is in possession of the following skills: Ultra Speed Regeneration, Steel Strength, Hockey, and the unique skill, Horde Lord. Horde Lord allows the user to gain complete control over their troops as long as they are of sufficiently low intellect. Once under their control, the user can share their troops' senses, gain the souls of all that they kill, and increase their own strength for each soldier under their command. It should also be noted that this individual is in fact in possession of a demon lord's seed, Puriel told him, making his face grow grim after hearing the unique skills description. That's not good. With how many the horde was killed, it wouldn't surprise me if he was at least a quarter of the way to achieving his harvest festival, Lucian thought. As he thought about the monster's unique skill more, though, he came to a realization. To weaken the monster to such an extent that it would be easy to kill it. Smiling, Lucian shouted out for all to hear across the battlefield. All men, fall back. He shouted out, putting a bit of his own hockey into his words to help ensure the men obeyed. It seemed though that wasn't necessary, many of the men following his command out of respect for him already. Richard shouting out the command as well in response made those that didn't do so already follow suit, believing in their chosen leader even more than they did their sudden ally. Lucian smiled as he saw the men fall back behind the wooden wall, then grimaced as he heard a shout from behind him. It was the mage, cursing up a storm and shouting at him. The old man stomped his feet and swore at Lucian in anger. How dare you order them to retreat? They need to do their duty and fight until the end. Think you'd be so cowardly to call for a retreat when we're this close to W-. The mage was cut off as Lucian pointed behind the mage, barely keeping a smirk of vindication from his face as the old man turned around. The mage had been so busy cursing out Lucian that he forgot about the fact he was currently fighting the troll general, likely due to his addled state from Alice's curse. The moment he turned around was the same in which he died, the troll using an overhead swing of his sword to cut the mage in half down the middle. Just like that, the mage was dead. Lucian looked on as the general stomped forward, not giving the mage's body so much as a second glance as he stepped over it on his way to Lucian. The Nephilim looked at him for a moment before checking the battlefield at large. Seeing all of those on his side had fallen back behind the barricade, he smirked and called out for his friend for the first time in a while. "Come forth and incinerate these bastards," he shouted out as his elemental companion came flowing out of him, and flew out into the battlefield. "You got it, Lucian," the greater elemental called out through their bond as he systematically burned all the remaining trolls to ashes. Soon the entire field was bathed in flames, and the sound of the dying. Lucian was glad he could call on Suzaku now. None of the remaining trolls had strong enough healing factors to resist his companion's flames. With the men now out of the way as well, the elemental was free to cut loose and burn them all till naught but ash and dust remained. As the trolls died one by one, Lucian saw as the general got weaker and weaker, soon even growing smaller as well. Once they all were gone, the monster before was no taller than his commanders had been now, and his power was only about twice as great as they'd been. As smirking as he saw the general's worried face, Lucian held Graham out and channeled his battle will into his sword, feeling as Graham pulled on his draconic core for power, and began to then, in an instant, Lucian flashed forward in a blitz of speed, and appeared behind the once menacing monster. As Lucian swung the now blood-covered Graham to rid it of the disgusting filth, the monster in question tried to turn to face him. However, it soon found it couldn't, and that instead it was falling. Everything went dark for the once mighty troll general as its body fell into dozens of cauterized pieces, even its head being cut into over 7 different chunks. And just like that, on the now silent battlefield where all that broke the quiet was the flicker of the cleansing flames made by Suzaku, the troll general died before it could awaken. A moment the flames died down, and a stillness was all that was left. A stillness that was soon broken by a cheer from one of the watching men atop the wall that was followed by the rest of the men. Now, as Lucian raised his sword into the air as a show victory, the battle was over. The terror of the trolls was over. And now, a new day could be ushered in free of their slaughter. Edited, January 28, 2026. Chapter 33, Chapter 31. Richard almost couldn't believe it, it was over. After months of either only being able to watch on as these monsters devoured men, women, and children, or being too late, and only seeing the leftover ruins of lives trampled, it was over. The trolls were dead, his men taking less casualties than he could have ever hoped, and not a single civilian death more. Victory he knew every general in his nation's history would have killed for. Now it was his. The young brown-haired man knew it wasn't due to his leadership though. No, it was all due to the man standing out in that field with his sword raised high. Him and his companions arriving had resulted in this victory, in this miracle. To say his gratitude was immeasurable would be an understatement. It was honestly more accurate to say that he felt a sense of thankfulness that bordered on loyalty, at least a loyalty he felt more strongly than he had for any royal or noble that had given him his death sentence marching orders. Now the people of his homeland were safe, with the death of the court mage his friends were free, and he now could lead hundreds of his men back to their families. And the man by the name Lucian Silver and his companions was who brought this near fantasy into reality, for that was more than he could say for any of those he'd sworn himself to in the past. Maybe that was a sign, one he would contemplate in the coming days. For now though, he had men to take care of and dead to send off. "Thank you, Lucian," Richard said quietly to himself before turning around to tend to the men, both living and dead. Lucian breathed in deeply despite not needing air in the first place. It had been about 2 days since the battle, and the death of the troll general. In that time they had all gathered all the dead, and put their bodies on ice using magic and stored them in a pocket space so as to allow them to be buried by their families. This was something he and Alice had offered to do after listening to Richard speak, on what to do about the bodies of the few casualties. Originally he was going to have them burned so as to prevent disease due to the inability to transport the bodies themselves. The two magic users decided that they wouldn't do so, and so offered this solution. Felt that the men who died deserved to be put to rest by their loved ones, and offer said loved ones the chance to say goodbye. So all 52 of the deceased were put on ice and stored for transport. To have only 52 casualties on their side was a monumental achievement for this world, at least for a human army. Those in Lucian's group though felt that each one was one too many for their liking. Blake especially took it hard, seeing the death of one of his own men firsthand at the jaws of the trolls had taken a toll on the young man. Lucian did his best to comfort his brother in all but blood and seemed to have done a good, though he knew full well that Blake was only handling it as well as he was due to his sheer will to never lose another under his command again. It was something he feared his brother wouldn't be able to uphold, but knew there was no way to dissuade him of that vow. That was fine though, it gave his brother more motivation to get stronger, and strength would be sorely needed in time. Now though Lucian and the men were soon to head out from the field of battle. They hadn't left yet due to needing to clean up the battleground, and all that was left in its wake. Troll corpses left behind after Suzaku's fire had been rounded up and burned in a pyre, Lucian taking a few bits and pieces for possible crafting at a later date beforehand. Then he and Alice had used some basic earth magic to smooth over the ground and repair any damage their battle had caused. The men had worked on taking down the fortification and packing up all the supplies as well, while those who were still injured rested up for the journey back. Now it was the night before the march back to the capital began, and Lucian sat out by the fire pit that was made in the center of his party's tents. Here he thought about what had been happening since his slaying of the troll general, and what was to come after. Monster dropped dead. All that was in its possession was claimed by him due to the effects of Grim Reaper. That included all the souls he had gained from his and his horde slaughter. Those souls though, or more accurately the soul energy, were tainted by the rage and agony from their deaths. He knew what such things could do if left unchecked, the memory of the murder night still in his mind's eye, leaving him in no doubt of what such a thing could cause. So he asked Puriel to cleanse the energy gained to make it available for use. That would take about a week still until the angelic skill was finished, but afterwards he would now have around 700 souls worth of energy from it. That wasn't including the souls of the trolls either, making up about 100 souls worth of energy due to their souls being weaker. The general's unique skill, Horde Lord, was also now in his possession, and he didn't really know what to do with it, to be honest. As it was not particularly useful to him, but he decided to keep it for now. Lucian thought that perhaps once he achieved his harvest festival it could become something useful. If not, he'll just have Puriel dissect it instead. Lucian saw as perhaps the most valuable gain of all was something else entirely, a second Demon Lord seed. The Nephilim already had a seed from his previous evolution, so he wasn't in need of one to ascend to the status of Demon Lord. However, having this spare one let him do something he hadn't thought to do before without risk. Something he had been debating on doing since he got it, in fact. Now though, he was certain after thinking it over for these past 2 days. Puriel, dissect the spare Demon Lord seed, he told the ultimate skill with conviction. Demon Lord seed is now being put through the process of dissection. Estimated time until any results or insights gained is 5 years, Puriel told him, a hint of exactment in the skill's voice at being able to study such a rare thing. Lucian sighed at that, not in sadness or disappointment but in relief. Relief that this choice was made and done with. Now I just need to wait and see if I've struck gold or lead, he said aloud to no one but the flames flickering in the darkness. Soon after he spoke those words though he saw a sight he had been expecting for a while. 2 men were walking towards him, both tall with one black of hair, the other blonde. And Shurzwa were coming to speak with him finally, it seemed. Bullet wasn't sure how to feel now, to be honest. Glad that he and the others had won. That the monsters he'd fought were dead. Elated that he and his fellow prisoner were now, or terrified that he now truly had nowhere to go, and a nation he needed to run from once more. All those feelings were present in him at this point, but relief was what ultimately won out. Relief that he and Shirzwa were free, and that all they'd come to call friends had lived through. The battle. That was what truly captured his heart, that and gratitude. He knew the mage's death wasn't normal, the man's actions were unlike him, to be honest. Not the ego or the sense of superiority, not that was in line with his character. It was the stupidity fueled by bravery that was not in line with what he knew of the man. The wielder of Incursio, first the weapon and now the skill, had mentioned such during the meeting held after the battle. When he'd done so, he saw a strange smirk on Alice and Lucian's faces that was quickly hidden. Being in night raid, and thus a group of assassins, had led to him being quite keen to spot such things, though. It had confused him at first, until he remembered what Alice had done to the trolls in the beginning of the conflict. A spell that befuddled the mind of the target/S and made them act without reason. That was near exactly what that damn jailer had seemed to have happened to him, losing his normal sense of reason to great detriment. It was easy to put two and two together after that. Bullet didn't say anything though, far be it from him to implicate his savior in the murder-tragic accident that the mage suffered. Now though he and Shirzwa had no idea on what to do, all they knew of this world was this kingdom. No ties to anywhere or anyone else. So he and his blonde friend had decided to ask for help from the one group of people not native to this Lucian and his group. Richard knew what they were doing, they'd told him such after all. He was a good kid and a better friend to them, so Bullet felt no risk in telling their temporary commander. Youngman had said was that he had 2 more casualties to report due to the mage's foolishness, and that was that. It was understood that the 2 summons would not be sticking around much longer. The former revolutionary was just glad that the lie of their death might buy them some time. Now he and Shirzwa walked to the part of camp that he knew Lucian to be at. There they found him sitting in front of a shimmering fire that illuminated his face faintly in the dark of the night. He spotted them near immediately and gestured to 2 log seats once they were close enough to feel the flames' warmth. The 2 other worlders looked at one another before sitting down on the indicated logs. For a time no one said a thing. So what do you think you'll do now? Now that you're free and all, Lucian asked the 2 after a time. Bullet looked to his companion and received a nod. The surly blonde had decided to let him do the talking for them, not trusting in his own people skills. The 100-man slayer had agreed, and so he took a breath before looking the white-haired man in the eyes. I was hoping you could help us with that actually. You were the one who helped free us after all, he said, getting a near devilish smirk from the man at those words. Why, whatever do you mean? Your freedom came about from the foolish actions of an egotistical mage, not any machination on mine or Alice's part, Lucian said, purposefully dropping the black-haired mage's name. Bullet smirked at the man's choice of words, knowing the unspoken message that laid within. Lucian had essentially just admitted it by mentioning the little spellcaster, and they both knew that was fine though. It seemed the look of gratitude in his and Shirzwa's eyes was seen by him, and received well regardless. That was all that mattered to him really, that the one who was responsible for his and Shiz's freedom knew of their thankfulness. He knew that Alice had done what she did on this man's orders. She was too loyal from what he'd seen to take any such action without the say-so of her leader. The bond the 2 had, in fact the bond all of Lucian's group had with him, was beyond mere leader and follower. Familial in a way except for Surtur. The giant of a man seemed to view Lucian with an air of reverence though that was more akin to how those loyal to a king were than a respected leader. It intrigued him, but for now it was none of his business. Yes, of course, silly me. Such an accident was most fortunate for us, and I was so grateful that I thought perhaps it was more than mere happenstance, the soldier-turned assassin said with a chuckle that Lucian returned. Bullet then went on to describe his and Shirzwa's current plight. Of how they had to leave this kingdom, but knew little of the outside world in this strange land. Of how they knew not where to go and thought that perhaps one who has traveled from beyond Malston's borders might be able to give them some direction. I can see the problem. I might just have an idea for you though, Lucian said with a smile that caught both of their attention. And what would that be? Shurzwa asked before Bulat could. The white-haired man stood up and looked the two of them in the eye before he spoke. I plan on me and mine leaving this country after getting paid by the king. So how about the two of you travel with us afterward and Alice protects you guys with some illusions in the... He offered them both to their shock. The soldier and the bartender looked at one another before nodding once more. Then, as one they answered the man who had helped save them from their chains. We'd be happy to, sir. So it seems that deplorable troll is dead now. What a shame, the silver-haired man said, while swirling a glass of wine. He was dressed in a white three-piece suit made from spider silk, an expensive set of clothes, but he was a man who enjoyed the finer things in life. The 300-year-old wine in his glass was but another example of this. The room he was in's furnishings further cemented. He sat on a dark wooden chair with silk cushions and gold inlays, a matching desk set before him filled more with trinkets than paperwork. A chandelier, currently unlit so as to bathe the room in darkness all the better to intimidate with, was hung from the ceiling and made from pure gold as well. The rug on his floor alone was worth more than what many made in a year. Kneeling on that rug was a hooded figure with green hair. This was the Magian that had told him of the development in the kingdom of Malstance. Specifically what had happened with the troll monster that had been causing havoc in the nation's eastern territories. He'd tasked his subordinate with keeping an eye on the situation, after hearing of it about 2 months ago. He had hoped to see if this monster could serve his plans of making a puppet demon lord. The beast had a seed already, it seemed, though. That meant it was too much of a risk to name the monster and make it his puppet. Oh well, this merely means I need to be more proactive in this endeavor of mine. I'll make my puppet from scratch, the Deathman thought with a sinister chuckle. The Magian before him shivered at that laugh, knowing it was never a good thing to hear come from her lord's mouth. She just hoped it wasn't something that involved her this time. Shaking had seemed to draw his attention though as he finally addressed her once more. Good work, Mjurin, you may go now, he said, leading her to get up from her kneeled position and move to the door. Thank you, Lord Clayman, she said before departing into the halls of the castle. Demon Lord Clayman smirked at having established her role as beneath him once more. Couldn't let her get too comfortable after all, and it had been some time since he'd had such a personal meeting with her. He knew that his possession of her heart was more than enough to keep her in line, but he firmly believed in the power of fear in making his puppets dance to their strings. He was the puppet master after all, and he couldn't abide one of his cutting free in any way. Now though, he was more focused on what and who his next toy would be. He didn't want to disappoint his partner after all by picking an ill-suited one. He stood up from his throne-like chair and walked to his window, looking out at his territory. The territory he'd inherited from his master. The one waiting for his return, the return he was helping to see come to fruition. Clayman raised his glass high in a solo toast of sorts. Soon, my lord, soon we will meet again. Lord Cazalim, he said with a voice filled with longing before drinking from his glass and savoring the taste of the wine. What he had no way of knowing though was the storm that was soon approaching. New demon lord soon to be born, one not beholden to any but themselves and those they called dear. One that cared little for the games Clayman reveled in, and would not take kindly to any of his schemes should they find out about them. Clayman had no idea that something new had come into being some time ago, and would soon usher in a time of change to the order he'd become so familiar with. Edited, January 28, 2026. Chapter 34, Chapter 32a/n. Sorry for the shorter chapter, I just found a really good stopping off point. You for reading, and I hope you all have a good day. It had been over 2 weeks of marching, but Lucian and the army had arrived back at the capital of Malstance once more. It was a remarkable time, to be honest, something only possible due to the amount of food and supplies that Lucian and his group could gather, and that had lightened the burden of the men and allowed for more time spent traveling with a lighter load. Thus, their travel time had been massively cut down as a result. As they approached the city's walls, Lucian saw a contingent of men waiting for them. It made sense to him that such a thing had been prepared, it wasn't exactly easy to miss. The large band of marching men flying their kingdom's flag after all. What did surprise him was seeing two men from his last time in the city, Luke and Noctis. The Nephilim was at the front of the group alongside Richard, and so waved at the two men with a grin on his face. The look he received in return gave him pause though. Both men waved back at him, and possessed a look of relief on their faces. However, both also seemed to have a look to them as if being the bearer of bad news. That didn't bode well, Lucian knew. I'm glad I told the others to wait out in the countryside with Shirzwa and Bulat, he thought to himself after clocking the look in the men's eyes. With a sigh, Lucian walked onwards into the city, soon being greeted by officials along with the young man had asked for him to be with him for this whole thing, wanting his view for the report he knew was coming. Though that report soon turned into a borderline interrogation once the two of them were taken by the officials to a room in the nearby guardhouse for a debriefing. Separated from the rest of the men, Richard seemed to deflate, as though suddenly losing confidence in himself. It was frustrating to see for Lucian how this young man, who had proven himself a great commander, seemed to shrink now that he was in the presence of those who had been deemed his betters by birth more than skill. Looking out at the assembled group of men that were there to receive the report, Lucian was quick to put together the men's noble background. There was Luke and Noctis, of course, both brothers in the same lesser noble house. Then there were three others that seemed to be in charge, each wearing a house crest on their clothes. He knew not their names, or the names of their houses, and to be honest he didn't really care. As the debrief began, he soon found his opinion to be proven justified. When hearing of the army's lacking supplies, losses, and difficulties in the field, the men before them seemed to scoff, blaming it on the incompetence of a commoner taking the lead, and the men asking for far too much for such a simple task. It infuriated him, to be honest, only the presence of Richard, and what the consequences for lashing out at the poor man might be holding him back from speaking his mind. That and how Luke and Noctis looked at the three men with a sneer that they hid whenever in the other noble's line of sight. After all was said and done, the near interrogation and criticizing session ended without the nobles so much as saying a thank you or a job well done. No, instead they received a curt dismissal and Richard a veiled comment about doing better. The fact that they referred to him as soldier the entire time, instead of the young man's true rank of commander, was another insult in Lucian's eyes. At this point I just want to collect my payment and say goodbye to this country, the silver-haired man thought to himself as he walked out of the room with Richard. Luke called him over not too soon afterwards though. Standing beside his older brother, he motioned for Lucian to follow them into an empty side room. He sighed and did as the guildmaster asked, soon finding himself in a conversation that made his annoyance turn to rage. The fuck you mean he doesn't plan on paying me? The king of Malstand sat on his throne as his advisors spoke around him. Reports were given, tax revenue counted, and an update on the troll situation made its way in. Apparently that adventurer who he'd hire, who had volunteered his services, had fought alongside their small detachment of men and beat back the trolls. That was good, their men finally proving their worth in his mind. If they couldn't even beat back such an insignificant threat, then what was the point of them? That was the king's thoughts on it, at least, fully disconnected from the reality of things. Despite gleefully claiming to be the current king of a warrior dynasty, the king hadn't had a true fight in his life. He'd never so much as sat foot on a true battlefield, only the ruins of one. After his men had won the day under his general's orders. He also hadn't seen a monster before with his own eyes, at least not a living one or one not in chains. So he had no idea the true threat that the trolls had possessed and cared not either way. It was as he laughed at a joke one of his advisors said that he heard a commotion. To the throne room soon opened up, and that same adventurer walked through, seemingly led in by his military advisor Noctis. The king saw the angered expression on the adventurer's face, and couldn't hold back a smirk. "Ah, the hero of our western lands. I must thank you for your volunteered service," he said as the silver-haired man stood at the foot of the dais. Lucian made a face like biting into a lemon at the king's words. It was no issue at all to hire out my services to you, Your Highness, Lucian said in response, stressing the word hire as he did so. As King Baltus smiled at him and said nothing for a moment, Lucian cleared his throat, and however, I would like to request the information of when I could expect my payment for my. I'm certain that the report of the job's completion has reached you by now, he said, looking the ruler right in the eyes. The king put on a false look of bafflement at the man's words. Baltus knew what he was doing. This wouldn't be the first time he'd done something like this after all. Whatever do you mean? You offered your assistance in taking out those detestable trolls out of the goodness of your heart, did you not? I seem to remember that quite clearly, the king said, not even bothering to hide his grin at this act of betrayal. Lucian looked on in almost disbelief at the man's audacity, and even more so as the king's advisors backed up the man's claim, saying how they remembered it going exactly as the king said, of how greedy he was for asking for a reward for such a simple task. Growing angrier and angrier, it was what the smarmy prince said next that made him lose it. Yes, it is quite a greedy thing for you to ask for compensation for doing such a basic task. Why, you should be honored to have helped out your betters, he said with a detestable grin on his face. That was when he lost it. My companions fought hard and saved your citizens from a monster you refused to send proper forces to handle. And yet you call it simple and refuse to acknowledge our deal. He shouted at them all, resulting in a deafening quiet afterwards. It took a moment before the prince spoke up once more. So what if they died? That's their duty, to give their lives at our command. If they perish, it merely means they were too weak, and not up to the standard one who represents this great nation should be held to, the prince said with a glare on his face at Lucian. Seeing the king nod along to his heir's words was the final straw. Screw it, he thought before suddenly looking at all as if he was a bastion of calm. The king and his court thought is the Mun admitting defeat. Noctis, who was right next to the silver-haired Mun, knew better though. An aura of power was starting to become visible around the Mun, and Noctis, due to going to place a hand on the man's shoulder, felt a hint of it unintentionally. That small taste of the warrior's aura was enough to make him pale considerably, as if suddenly he was standing before a reaper instead of a Mun. Very well, Lucian spoke, voice deceptively calm, as it seemed to echo around the hall. I shall consider this a breach of contract. I must warn you though, the consequences are likely to be dire in scope. The king blustered on his throne at that statement from the men he saw as lesser than himself. Is that a threat? Guards, detain this insolent fool, he shouted out as armored men with halberds came in and surrounded Lucian. Noctis was pulled back and separated from the silver-haired men. That let him get a better view of what happened next. The guards pointed their halberds at the Mun, and then their shadows moved. In the blink of an eye, the guards had their own shadows turned against them, becoming bound by dark strings made of their own dark reflections. It was then that Lucian spoke once more. Silhouette binding. After saying the name of this strange technique, he raised his hand, and the guards had their bodies puppeteer into an at-rest position. Their weapons no longer pointed at Lucian, they were now forced to stand perfectly, unnatural, still and straight. Then, as the adventurer walked forward, the men parted for him against their own desires, with their shadows now more in control than their minds. He walked up to the king's throne, seeming to ignore the sense of fear that had pervaded the once he was but a foot away from the ruler of Malstance. He spoke once again. Know this, your greed has doomed you. You who let your people suffer, who sits there thinking yourself better. You have angered someone with power you know not, and the fallout shall be dire, he said in a soft voice that could be mistaken for gentle if it were not for the sense of terror it seemed to inspire. Just as the king was about to stand up and confront the upstart, it happened. A wave of power and force rocked the throne room, an aura of pure gray that inspired a feeling of being judged came from the Mun who had just spoken. And that feeling of being judged ended with only one verdict: they were found wanting. Fear and doom were all the humans knew in that moment, only Noctis being spared the full force of it. But the king felt an even stronger form of it, being the main target of Lucian's hockey. Baltus couldn't move, couldn't blink, could barely breathe from the sheer fear he felt in that at that instant he didn't feel like a king, or even a man. No, he was an ant before a titan, and was soon to be squashed. That was what it was to stand against this man, this titan of power beyond what he had ever felt even from the summoned otherworlders he'd ordered. Made into slaves. And then, just like that, it was over. Lucian was gone, spatial movement taking him away from the room, and leaving them all in fear from the aftermath. Noctis took a deep breath before speaking out unconsciously. "What have you all done?" he seemed to whisper to himself, going unnoticed by the others, and the guards fell once Lucian vanished like puppets with their strings cut. Despite not being under the same spell, many of the nobles in the room fell to the floor as well, from relief or terror, even though they weren't sure. Noctis saw all this and began to plan. Not for how to fight against the new threat he knew Lucian posed, but how for him and his to survive what came next. Lucian sighed as he appeared in the clearing his group had set up camp in, and sat down on a tree stump that was nearby. He sat there thinking about what was to come now. Puriel, what exactly will happen to the king now that he has broken our deal? He asked this would be his first broken deal after all. After studying the unique skill-soul bargain, it has been determined that due to the risk involved in the deal on your end that a grave punishment will be given. Previously agreed upon compensation shall be given to you, as well as additional compensation for the breach of contract. The individual King Baltus will likely be severely punished due to the soul-bound nature of the deal, and have great harm inflicted upon him, Puriel told him after a moment. So, does that mean he could die? The Nephilim thought to himself. Due to the nature of the contract involving the risking of one party's life to achieve the requested task, it is likely that breaking said contract by refusing to give the agreed-upon compensation would result in such an outcome, his ultimate skill answered him. That made the Nephilim sigh once more, having thought that such would be the outcome of the king's betrayal of their deal. Even if he wanted to, he wouldn't be able to save the king, for he couldn't break a deal, or stop the ramifications of one breaking it themselves. Made deals that created a soul-deep vow in essence, something that allowed for the trading of it, also made any punishment for breaking said vow gravely dangerous. Standing up, he walked over to his companions' camp and sat down amongst them. All sitting around a campfire with a pot of stew hanging over it. Having noticed their leader return, they all quieted their conversations. It was Alice who asked what they were all wanting. "So, how'd it go?" she asked, having seen the stressed look on her sire's face. "Not good. We'll need to leave this country quickly," he told them with a tired tone of voice. The group all looked at one another, confused on that. They had already planned to leave soon, but his mentioning of doing so quickly was unlike their leader to say for no reason. "Why's that, Lucian?" Blake asked this time with a steady voice, seeming to be preparing for something he was glad he did at his brother's next words. "I don't really want to stay in a country where I'm about to be accused of regicide." Edited, January 28, 2026. Chapter 35. Chapter 33. After telling his companions what had transpired, they wasted no time in packing up everything to move out immediately. Once everything was packed up and placed in spatial storage, Lucian then informed them of his newest decision, one that he felt was sorely needed. "You're sure this is a good idea? What if they're unprepared?" Blake asked his brother with some concern. Lucian turned to him and was about to reassure the teen, but his spawn beat him to it. "Don't worry, Blake, our newest sibling will have enough instincts to fulfill the basics of this task well enough," Alice told him with a smirk, having full faith in her new sibling even before their creation. Blake sighed at that but did seem more at ease with the assurance the demon gave. Then Lucian spoke up. "Plus, I have a good set of skills I plan to give them to aid in their task. With them there's no way that they'd be found out," he told the redhead, making his little brother relax all the way. Nodding to the Nephilim, Blake stood back with the others, Shirzwa and Bulat looking the most unsure out of all of them. After all, they had just found out that their new leader was a Nephilim capable of making demons, and that two of the warriors they'd gotten to know were such. It wasn't too bad for them though, they knew who Lucian and the others were, and their race changed little for them. They just weren't sure what they were about to see. Taking a breath, Lucian focused on Progenitor of Grey for the first time in a while. Summoning forth the power of demonic creation, he concentrated on the image and desire he had for this newest demon. Infiltration. Spy, he thought to himself, the last word seeming to encapsulate everything he wished for in his newest family member. In a flash a grey circle came into being, and a glowing form began to form. Bit by bit the form of a person was built until the light finally died down. In the light's place now knelt a strange-looking figure. They possessed 6 arms and 2 legs, the 4 lower arms seeming to be thinner and more fragile-looking. Their face looked human-like except for the 2 sets of smaller eyes above the normal set, and a mandible-like protrusion around their lower jaw. Was as if a spider had started to become a man, but had stopped just short of completion. The new demon's hair was a dull grey like that of an overcast sky, and their eyes shone a red that made Lucian think of blood. It was as he had finished cataloguing his new spawn's appearance that they spoke up. "My lord, I am here to serve," they said with their mandible clicking as they spoke. Lucian regarded them for a moment, not in judgment but in consideration. "What should I name them?" "Well, Alice and Alfred both start with an A, so I think that could be my theme. It's better than just going with cars and coping Rimuru," he thought to himself before focusing back on his spawn. "I appreciate your loyalty, and so, as my spawn, I shall give you a name before your first task," he said to the spider-looking demon. They looked happy at those words and waited in silence for their sire to grant them this boon. Lucian spoke with Puriel first, however. "Do you think you can transfer the skills and rudimentary knowledge through the naming process like we talked about?" he asked the skill. "Yes, the transfer of skills such as shadow motion, presence concealment, and body double among others is possible through the naming process. As well as the granting of all knowledge on stealth, infiltration, and espionage that has been gleaned from your memories, and independent analysis will be accomplished," Puriel told him, making him, "Well then, that's all I needed to know," the Nephilim thought before speaking once more. "I shall name you Alex, my spy master," Lucian said, and his words were followed by the now named Alex glowing as their form changed. King Baltus sat on his throne, unconcerned about what had occurred the previous day in that very room. He had been frightened of the power shown by that insolent man, but now it was only a matter of time until he was dealt with. He'd given the order to have the man hunted down and brought before him, and his companions to be killed as well. Now there was a country-wide manhunt out for the adventurer Lucian's head. The king smirked as he brought forth his glass of wine to take a sip at the thought. What he didn't know, what even Lucian himself didn't know, was that once the king had given his rejection of upholding his end of their deal, a timer had started. This timer counted down, starting at 24 hours and getting closer to 0 every second. Now, it was approaching the 24-hour mark since his refusal to pay, and the timer was almost at then. As the last one turned to 0, something happened to the king. "Notice, you have failed to uphold your end of a soul bargain. Punishment is being determined," the king heard a strange voice say to him. At first he looked around in shock and bewilderment at hearing such a thing, looking for who, however, he quickly determined that the voice was in his head. "Is this the words of the world?" he thought in growing dread once he came to that conclusion. Baltus stood up then and moved to find help of some sort, panic driving his actions when he heard it once more. "Calculations complete. Punishment shall now be given," was the last thing the king heard. Except for his screams for mercy. To the observers in the throne room, they had been surprised when the king suddenly stood up from his throne. Then the king started to scream and plead to some unseen force. None knew why he was doing such a thing, until they noticed the king's feet. Starting from the king's toes, it seemed both what he was wearing and his very flesh were slowly transforming into a glittering substance. A metal they all knew well, for the castle was filled with decorations and such made from it, gold. Slowly, agonizingly, the king turned to gold bit by bit. Soon mages and healers were called in, few being able to come fast enough to try anything. None of what the scant few tried did anything to so much as slow it down, though. In a matter of minutes the greedy King Baltus turned to solid gold, an expression of pure terror and agony on his face forever immortalized in the statue he'd become. What they would find out later with some analysis was that the king had not in fact been turned into the precious metal known as gold. Instead, he was now made of the material often referred to as fool's gold. When Lord Noctis heard of this sometime later, all he could think of was the poetic irony that such a punishment was. That, and the loss of half the royal family's treasury made for one hell of a punishment, he felt. And unbeknownst to any of those in the throne room that day, a small figure watched on from a ceiling corner, ready to report to their sire what had transpired there. It had been 3 days since his father had turned into solid gold. Fool's gold at that, the prince-turned-king thought with a sneer. Prince Bulik, now King Bulik II, cared not about his father's death, truth be told. To say that the events of late hadn't absolutely infuriated him though. It wasn't the fact that his lord father was now dead that made his blood boil, but the matter of how it happened. Fat king who had set the throne before him had fallen in his bedchambers wrong and died. Then Bulik would likely have danced in celebration, in private of course. Now though, having the previous king be so publicly and strangely assassinated was a major problem. In the aftermath of his father's death, Bulik's coronation was rushed to try and uphold some semblance of strength. He knew they couldn't afford to appear weak to the wider world. Malstance wasn't viewed with any real favor by the other nations of the Council of the West after all. Not to mention the fact that Bulik knew there were plenty of lords who would be more than eager to bring up how they were some second cousin of a royal bastard of something in order to press their own claim, should they feel the throne was within their. All that was enough to make his crowning as king bittersweet at best, an annoyance at worst. The politics of it all Bulik was sure he could handle. No, it was something else that made him half the treasury of his family was gone. Not just gold either, but everything from jewelry to paintings, heirlooms to decorative rugs was now halved in quantity. Everything that could be considered assets of the royal family was subject to the price paid. Included the armory that housed their ancestors' weapons. The kingdom of Malstance had been formed by a warlord that was later reported as a hero once he claimed his place as king. From what Bulik had read, his ancient ancestor had been an enlightened that took command of several warring tribes to form this nation some centuries ago, and it was then built up into what it now was over the generations. Now though, the kingdom his family had carved with steel was at risk of falling due to this mess. Bulik wasn't stupid, or at least he liked to think so. He knew the royal family had lost a good amount of sway, and only 2 things kept them where they belonged on top. That was their wealth that they used for mercenaries and bribery, and the weapons of their ancestors that they loaned out to champions to deal with unruly lords. Now both those things were severely hampered, and it was only due to his quick actions that at least the truth of the armory being halved was kept under wraps. Gnashing his teeth, Bulik decided it was time he took some drastic action. Standing up from his throne, he looked out at his court, the statue of his father still there due to the fear some held of the king's fate being contagious. Why couldn't you have at least turned to real gold so I could have gotten some value out of this mess, he thought with contempt for his late father. Clearing his throat, he spoke aloud to his assembled court full of lords and generals. This injustice cannot stand. Look what has happened to our beloved king, the young royal said while barely getting the word beloved out with a straight face. The assembled officials looked at the golden mockery with anger in their eyes at his words. That man who calls himself Lucian needs to pay. I'm certain he is behind this. However, I begrudgingly must recognize the scoundrel's power if he accomplished such a thing as this. Therefore, I henceforth order the deployment of the army to hunt down and confront this. He shouted out, getting cheers from the lords and military men he'd called on. The sight made him smile, feeling as if all would be right in the end with his nation's whole military might behind this. Let's see how that bastard handles thousands of swords coming for him, Bulik thought. It was once the cheers died down though that something happened. A presence entered the room, one that Bulik recalled from but a few days prior. However, this time there was something different to it. Something monstrous. It had been a few days since creating and naming Alex, and Lucian had had them all move past the borders of Malstance since then. Using spatial movement he'd taken them towards the Kusha Mountains in the east so he could begin the journey to the next destination he had. That had been the plan at least, until Alex gave him the information that made him order them all to set up camp and give him time to think. Alex had changed in appearance with their naming, going from a lesser demon to a greater demon did that. Now the newest of his spawn looked more human in appearance, their extra arms now being retractable, and the extra eyes fading into dots when not summoned forth. The mandible that once protruded from their lower jaw was now a dark, almost tattoo-like design along their jaw instead. Their skin was alabaster white that heightened their androgynous look. Even after these past few days, Lucian couldn't tell what gender they were in that moment, almost as if it was something they could change on a whim should they. It worked well for their disguises though, allowing them to assume whatever role they felt was needed for their task. That in combination with a surprise for Lucian made them all the greater at their purpose as his spy and assassin. The surprise in question was that Alex was found to have an affinity with the compress skill that Surtur had. So the Nephilim gave the demon a copy, and now they had their body doubles shrink down to the size of a house spider in order to spy on their targets. It was quite the handy skill, and it made him wonder about getting some actual spider familiars for his newest spawn. It was due to one such shrunk body double that Alex had sent to the castle through shadow motion that they found out what happened to the king. Or the former king would be more accurate really. I didn't expect him to get the Midas treatment. The insane amount of stuff was already a lot, he thought in regard to the king, and the loot gained from the broken contract. Now Lucian had more money than he knew what to do with, and more random rich people stuff as well. What truly surprised him from the haul, besides the amount that is, was the unique grade gear that came with it. From what Puriel had told him, the gear was hundreds of years old, and it was likely some form of royal heirloom back from the family's days. As regardless, he knew the new king wouldn't take the loss of such things lightly. Led to now, with him trying to plan his next move now that he'd sufficiently pissed off a country after saving it. Why couldn't that blasted man just pay me what was owed? The silver-haired man thought in frustration. It was after this thought that Alex came up to him with a look he was slowly beginning to the "I have something to tell you" look. "Sire, I have something to inform you of. One of my doubles is currently witnessing the new king of Malstance, giving his decision on how to deal with you," Alex said in a calm and collected voice, sounding far more dutiful than their older siblings. Lucian sighed at that. "Show me if you would." He asked the gray-haired demon, and received a nod in reply before his newest spawn sent him a thought communication. Through the thought communication Lucian bore witness to what his spy's mini-me saw, and he watched on as the new king rallied the nobles and generals into a hunting frenzy with him, and his as the prey. The Nephilim noted that Noctis wasn't present though, which made him smile a bit. But after that Lucian grew mad, to see this king put all the blame on him, and refuse to acknowledge his own wrongdoing in the matter was expected but still infuriating. Damn these petty men and their arrogance. To think common soldiers could kill me is very insulting, but to have my family in the line of fire as well is enraging. If only I could show my full power, to make them fear me, since that seems to be the only way to gain respect in this world. Just like them. His thoughts trailed off at that, remembering how monsters gained recognition in this world. Lucian hummed in thought for a moment, remembering what he knew of the forces Malstance could bring to bear. "I always knew I'd need to achieve the status of a true demon lord to be anything in this world. I had just hoped to take some time to do so. Now though, it appears I have an opportunity that I can't pass up and an enemy I can't dissuade." "Very well then," thought with a growing sinister-looking smile. "It seems I must prepare for a festival," he said aloud before warping back into the throne room of Malstan's king. Once there in that hall, Lucian saw as the gathered men looked on in worry. It made sense though, he wasn't holding anything back this time. From his back grew his silver bat-like wings, and his presence now held something to it that was beyond human. It was both corruptive and holy in equal measure, as befitting his nature. None of that mattered to him, no, all that mattered was delivering his message. "You wish to start a war with me, it seems, yes?" he asked while looking directly at the king, channeling his inner Diablo for this act. The king trembled, but it seemed his lack of sense made for an ignorant kind of bravery as he stood his ground as best he could. "And so what if we do, demon?" he shouted out, likely putting on a show of his own, for the Lucian gave a sinister chuckle at that, fully embracing his role now. "Then I'd tell you this, if you wish to fight me and reclaim all that has been taken from you, there is only one chance. In 3 months' time, go to the field where the troll general fell, and I will meet you in battle," he told them all, getting a strange look from the assembled. "Why would we agree to that?" some lord or general yelled at him. "Because if I wanted to, you'd never be able to find me or your stolen goods," Lucian said with a sneer, putting even more pressure on all present. When it seemed the gathered officials, and the more so the king, understood the message, Lucian eased up on the pressure and moved to leave. Before that, though, he looked over his shoulder at the king. "And for your information, I am not a demon, but that which is the union of heaven and hell. I am a Nephilim," was all he said before using spatial magic to vanish back to his family, leaving a terrified audience in the throne room of the now doomed nation. Edited, January 28, 2026. Chapter 36. Chapter 34. After returning to the campsite, Lucian told them all what had happened in the throne room. Of how they were now at war with the nation they'd just helped save, and of how in 3 months' time a battle would take place at the site of their recent victory against the troll. They all reacted in their own ways, of course, to such news. Blake looked concerned. Of course he'd be. He didn't doubt his brother's strength, or his own for that matter, but he was just a normal human not too long ago. So a part of him couldn't help but feel that going against a whole nation was suicide of the most elaborate kind. However, Blake also knew one thing with far greater certainty than that: his brother would win no matter what, and would rather die than risk losing those he cared for in a battle he didn't think he could win. That was enough to set him more at ease about the whole thing, even with the reservations he held. The demon trio, even if not especially including the new addition of Alex, looked ready for war themselves. It was a foregone conclusion that they'd stand by their sire in this war too. If anything, the three were pissed that the king, both new and old, had pushed things to this point. It infuriated them all to see the sire so disrespected. Alfred was raring to go and bash in some heads. Alice was already planning out some more destructive spells to send a message, while Alex started to think of targets. Targets for assassination that would aid them in the war to come. Specifically, after them was Surtur, who simply looked stone-faced. He was like a soldier given marching orders that he'd follow even if it meant walking into hell itself. These people, Lucian especially, had given him something he'd always wanted, and he didn't mean a name. Like he belonged here, like he was valued and seen as a friend. The giant was more than a freak here with these people, he was closer to family in a way. So to hear that some pathetic king was threatening, that was more than enough to make him prepare himself for the conflict. He would bathe the land in molten rock if it came to it, in order to show just how much they had messed up threatening his new home. Finally, there was Shirzwa and Bulat, who each reacted a bit differently. Shirzwa looked like he finally had a good reason to get angry, and was going to enjoy the carnage, having slowly learned to accept himself among his new comrades. Now that he had the chance to beat the ones who saw him into chains, he was more than willing to let his wild side out. Bulat, on the other hand, had a strange look on his face, one that was a mix between determination and nostalgia. With Lucian knowing of the man's past, that wasn't too strange a sight to him. After all, this would be the second time he faced a nation of with naught but a ragtag group of. With all that said, it was Blake that spoke up first with the question they all had. "So what's the plan, bro?" he asked the silver-haired man. Lucian gave a smirk that would have sent shivers down a lesser man's spine at that. "Why, become a demon lord, of course," Lucian responded in a casual way. Blake and the others nodded at that. "Ah, yes, that's an effective PLA. Wait, what?" Blake interrupted himself mid-sentence once the words fully registered. Lucian's laughter didn't help matters one bit, he felt. Once Lucian was done laughing at the incredulous look on their faces, he decided to explain in detail what his plan was. "All right, I'll explain properly now," he began with a shake of his head at their expecting. "First, I'll start off by saying that I am not becoming a demon lord in preparation for this war. No, instead I am going to use this war to become one. In order to become a true demon lord one needs two things, a demon lord seed, which I have, and roughly 10,000 human. I have always intended to become a true demon lord, but this has massively moved up the timetable for that, he explained and stopped when he saw that they had questions, particularly his brother. But Lucian, the redhead began, why do you wish to become a demon lord at all? It seemed that the redhead was uncertain why his brother was striving for such a title, such he knew his brother wasn't one to chase power for power's sake, especially at such a high cost. So there had to be a reason. It is because of two reasons really. The first and more immediate reason is that no one will take me seriously while being so weak. In front of those with real power in this world we are nothing, and so they will treat us as such. For instance, if I was known as a true demon lord, then Malstance would never have dared to go back on their deal with me. Likewise, the respect and reputation of a demon lord will grant us safety from all those that wish to use us for the most part, was what Lucian responded with. Bullet cleared his throat after that before speaking up. And the other reason, he asked, deadly serious. The former resistance fighter wasn't being confrontational by asking that. He wasn't even all that taken aback about the lives needed in order to ascend like most humans would be. Was the Hundredman Slayer after all, and it was more than possible that he had killed closer to 1,000 in his career with the Empire and later as a member of Night Raids, so hearing this wasn't overly shocking to him. No, he asked because he knew that look from commanders he'd followed. A look speaking of a greater threat on the horizon. Lucian sighed before answering the man's question. The second is that I need to get stronger, need us all to get stronger, is that a great calamity is on the horizon. In close to a decade's time, an invasion of this world shall occur by the forces of the angels known as the Great Tenma War according to the historical records. I highly doubt that they will not take issue with the nature of my existence, he told them. Sounding so incredibly tired all of a sudden. They all looked surprised at those words, having never heard of such a thing. The demons due to their limited life experience, Surtur and Blake due to growing up in isolated communities, and the otherworlder duo from the fact of their non-native status to this world. As they thought it over, though, they all could see what their leader meant by that. Would such beings not take issue with him, a Nephilim? Something that had never existed before, and something more powerful than it rightly should be. Best case scenario, they would try and force him to join them. Worst case, they decided to exterminate him, and all that would defend him. Suddenly their leader's need for strength made sense. To have a chance against a heavenly host, he would need the power of a demon lord to stand even a chance. That was all, not even with them knowing what he knew of the angel's true goal. Of Feldway's plan to destroy everything and kill the world his creator loved in a massive case of daddy issue-born rebellion. Of the powers that would wake in the coming war, powers that all but the strongest will be helpless against. I need to gain power if I hope to protect this, Lucian thought as he looked out at his family. So, the plan for the next 3 months is this: all of you will be doing your best to get stronger before my accession. From what I have learned, when I become a demon lord, gifts shall be given to those close to me. So I want you all as strong as possible before that in order to get the most out of it. That means, however, that we will need to split up for now, he told them in a gravely serious tone of voice. At their beginning protests, Lucian spoke once more. I know you don't necessarily like it, but this is what is needed. You can't grow like you all need to if I'm there holding your hand every step of the way. No, you need to go out and grow on your own. Don't worry though, through the soul connection we have we can communicate over any distance, and if I need to I can summon you to me through it, the Nephilim said to them, informing them of the new skill that Puriel had developed just for this occasion. They still didn't look like they particularly liked it, but they understood what he meant. Knew he was right, that in order to grow fast enough they would need to go and train individually in order to seek out what worked best for them. Didn't mean they had to enjoy it. Fine, Blake sighed, how are we doing this? Lucian smiled gently at his brother, thankful for his trust. I shall split you up into groups, but first I have something I need to do. Alice, Alfred. Forward please, I believe you've grown enough for this, he told them, and the two demons stepped forward before kneeling by some unspoken command. First Lucian placed his hand on Alfred's head. I grant you the name Alfred Young, he said, and a glow enveloped the white-haired man. Next he placed his hand on Alice's head. I grant you the name Alice Een, he spoke, and she glowed just like her brother. Once the glows died down, the two looked more or less the same. Perhaps a little more mature-looking in a way, if anything. What was noticeably different was their power. Despite not achieving an evolution, they had each gained a great amount of power. If Lucian were to guess, the two of them were now on the precipice of turning into demon lords, and they would be gaining new skills in their near future. Perhaps even a new unique skill would awaken in them both before the harvest festival from how much they had gained in Ra. The duo nodded in thanks before standing back up and returning to standing with the other, seemingly marveling at their greater power once they did so. At the look from the others, Lucian decided to explain. A second name, or last name if you prefer, counts as a second name. That was why I insisted on gaining the name Lucian Silver after all. So I decided to name them a second time, as I feel it wouldn't hamper their development at this point, he said, and as he spoke he looked at his brother. He knew Blake didn't have a last name, but naming worked differently for humans. Although he's not exactly human anymore. He's an enlightened. He trailed off in thought before coming to a decision. Blake, would you like a name as well? He asked the teen, and received a shocked look, and Blake took a moment to think it over before nodding his head. He would gladly accept a name from his brother. Walking before his brother, he waited patiently. I will tell you now, I shall not give you the name Silver. Not because you are not my family, but because I want you to form your own legend with your own name, he told the teen, a smile on his face at the redhead's nod of focus. That's fine by me. I'll carve my own name into the rock of history, not relying on you to do so, he said with firm resolve. Lucian looked at the young man fondly, remembering how far they'd come together. That teen in some nowhere village had become this great warrior before his eyes, had become his brother after all this time. He reminisced on how Blake did everything with his whole heart, from fighting and training, to smithing and leading. It made the name all the more fitting in his mind for his little brother. Then I shall name you Blake Brightheart, he said, and a glow enveloped his brother to his slight surprise. It seemed he was right, and now he could rest a little easier knowing that his brother would be stronger. Word had spread quickly from the capital of Malstance of the war against some abomination that killed the previous king that called itself a Nephilim. An announcement had been released by order of the king, about a reward for all those that joined him in this fight against the enemy of humanity, as he called it. Mercenaries from all over were coming in droves at that decree, especially once they heard it was only a group whose number didn't even reach the double digits. They all felt it would be an easy payday. Watching this all transpire from the sidelines were the demon lords and other people of importance. In particular, a few had their own thoughts on the situation. Guy Crimson found the whole thing fascinating. He knew that Lucian was that strange new member of his lineage, but to have it come out that he wasn't a normal demon. Him, oh so curious indeed. After getting the news of what was happening, he knew what was coming next. A demon lord was soon to be born, it seemed. He hoped this one would help shake things up, if for no other reason than to alleviate his boredom. However, just in case things started to require his intervention, he tasked Misery with sending forth her network to keep tabs on the Mun. He just hoped he wouldn't need to exercise his role as the mediator because of this interesting. Gazeld Wargo also was quite interested in this development. He hadn't been too shocked at hearing that the Mun that had made such a splash in his nation wasn't human, though his unique race did draw his attention. Initially he was concerned to hear of the seeming regicide the Mun had committed, but after he set his intelligence network to the task of finding out all that happened, he was more reassured. It seemed that the king of Malstance had let his greed get the best of him, and it resulted in his demise. The fact that Lucian had killed a troll general, and for such little expected compensation, made the Dwarven king all the more inclined to believe that Silver-Haired Man was in the right here. It was a great insult to his honor as a ruler to have someone who purported themselves a king act so shamelessly. Nephilim, as he called himself, had essentially saved that man's nation from a terrible threat that should have had the man proclaimed a hero, and yet he was treated with such disrespect. The fact that Gazel felt he owed that man a debt made the whole situation all the more galling to him. As such, when he heard of an order for equipment coming in from that nation for their ensuing war, he made a decision. Dworgen was neutral after all, so who could blame him for maintaining that neutrality for their war? Make a habit of supporting nations that weren't allies with his own needlessly, especially one that saw dwarves as no better than monsters to be killed. It seemed to him though that Malstance would soon no longer be required on his map in the near future if he was right in his gut feeling. And he highly doubted he was wrong on that. To the west, in the nation that was home to the Holy Church, a black-haired woman was reacting to the news as well. She was surprised to hear her friend was in such a situation, sure, but a part of her knew something like this was coming. She just didn't think it would be this when her wayward student, now once more connected and in contact with, asked her if this was really the man she had traveled with. Shizu had confirmed it. She had asked Hinata to look deeper into the matter before casting judgment, knowing that Lucian wouldn't do something like this needlessly. It had taken a bit of convincing, but the captain of the Holy Knights had agreed to send out feelers for some information. In a few days, the church's information network bore fruit, and they were both informed about what had truly transpired. Malstance wasn't a nation particularly skilled at keeping their secrets, especially with the crisis they now faced. So, it was easy for them to learn of how the previous king had betrayed Lucian after her companion had done something worthy of the title hero for the man's nation. It made her angry to say the least, but at least it made her student realize she had been wrong to immediately judge him. That was good, she didn't want her student to get the wrong impression of him. Shizu did worry though, worry about what would happen once this battle was over for him. From the sounds of it there was a large enough army getting gathered, one that would give enough fuel for him to awaken. She knew he must have the seed by now, knew he would likely ascend at the end of this conflict. She just hoped he'd be the same man she had kissed all that time ago when they next met. Please don't change too much, you silly man, she thought to herself before speaking more on the subject of the coming changes to the world with her student. Unbeknownst to her, however, a silver-haired heterochromia, having woman in a maid outfit watched on from nearby. She pondered about the changes that were sure to come about this Lucian that would soon be the name on the lips of many. I wonder if Walpurgis will be called in the near future, she mused idly before leaving her precious Hinata to her teacher. It seemed that it was getting closer to the time of change she had been told of all those years ago. Things are about to get interesting, it seems, she said with a smirk befitting the Queen of Nightmares as she walked back to her chambers. Edited, January 28, 2026. Chapter 37. Chapter 35. It had been 2 days since Lucian had done the naming ceremony, called such for lack of a better term. After bestowing new last names unto his first spawn, and Blake, he'd then divided the group up into separate teams. The first team consisted of himself, and the newly christened Blake Brightheart, and they were the only ones with a clear destination in mind. The other teams consisted of Alice and Bullet paired with one another, Shurzwa, and Alfred, and finally Surtur and Alex. Alice and Bullet were heading off the south to the kingdom of Malukshur in hopes of learning more magic, at least Alice was. Bullet was more or less her muscle and physical damage dealer for now. It worked just fine for the man since he could continue his physical training easily enough in the meantime. The demon was looking forward to this trip as she hoped to gain a greater insight into the mystic arts from the nation that was so intricately linked to the magic tower. After hearing about its nature as one of the most well-known and accessible magic schools in the world, she had grown fascinated with it. Now, with the need to get stronger, Alice would take this opportunity to explore it to her utmost to squeeze every bit of knowledge out of the nation that she could. Meanwhile, Alfred and Shurzwa decided to go further west in hopes of potentially going to the border of the Badlands in order to face some strong monsters that wander out of the wastes. Alfred had heard during their travels of how strong monsters from the magically irradiated land came through the borders constantly, although it was typically the weakest of the desert's inhabitants that did so. The beasts would be driven out from their deadly home either due to resources running short, or a stronger monster taking their territory for themselves. Still, even those monsters tended to at minimum be rank or higher. A stream of foes like that was plenty enticing for the physical fighters. Surtur headed off with Alex into the Kusha Mountains near the border of Malstance. Would allow the giant descendant to train in the rocky region, while still being close enough for Alex to accomplish their chosen task. The youngest of Lucian's spawn had chosen to form the beginnings of their own spy network. For now it would be formed from their own body. Doubles, but in time they hoped to recruit more independent operatives. Both they and Lucian knew the importance of an information network, especially with the power the latter was soon to come into possession of. To not have a web of spies and informants was akin to willful blindness once Lucian entered the world stage. After all, something that becoming a demon lord would make his reality. Lucian meanwhile had a special destination in mind for him and Blake. The Republic of there he hoped to gain an audience with a certain fairy, and give Blake something to increase his power even more. The counterpart to the demon lord seed, a chosen heroes he knew his brother had what it took, the Nephilim had no doubt in his mind. Besides, every demon lord needs a hero, right? I just don't have to fight mine, Lucian thought with a smirk as he looked at the slumbering form of his brother, shaking his head at the mumbled words he let out in his sleep. It would be quite interesting, Lucian thought, to see just what kind of elemental may answer his brother's plea. That would have to wait though, they needed to find the fairy's labyrinth first after all. It took 3 more days to make it to the Republic, and a further 5 of gathering information from locals on where to go, but they had made it to the general vicinity of the labyrinth's last known entrance. Now the 2 men were trekking through the wild forest of the nation's chief national park of sorts in search for the home of one of the most ancient demon lords. Demon lord that just so happened to also be the elemental queen that was given a task by the creator Veldanava in order to maintain the balance of the world. How could the little pixie, known as Ramiris, do such a task? Well, when she'd initially been given the task she wasn't such a small and relatively weak being. No, she'd been quite powerful in her own right, but after calming down the second demon lord Malim Nava she had been stuck in an endless cycle of reincarnation. Each time she was reborn her power would regress to that of a small pixie, only holding on to her title of queen, and her intrinsic skill small world. That very skill was what was making the very labyrinth Lucian and Blake sought out in fact. Lucian explained all this to his red-headed brother as they camped that night. He told Blake bits and pieces of the story as they traveled, but thought now was the time for a more thorough explanation rather than all piecemeal like he'd done up till now. Of course, all this made Blake ask a particularly important question. Why are we going to see her then? The teen who looked more akin to a grown man said. Lucian smiled wryly and decided to understate a bit. It is my hope that you will be able to contract a powerful elemental to aid you in your one that shall partner with you like Suzaku has for me. You saw how strong Shizu is with the help of her own Ifrit, even with the problems it gives her. A more agreeable elemental to call your ally could give you a whole new level of power. I even hear that the hero King Gazel Dwargo has an earth elemental that aids him as well, he told the teen, watching as the mentioning of Shizu and the hero king made his brother gain a wishful look. Lucian knew his brother loved the stories of great heroes that he told him. Stories of King Ortha and Gilgamesh, of Hercules and Perseus. Of heroes that rose from obscurity and became kings on their own merit and skill than of birth. Those particularly grabbed his brother's attention, and it made him smile at the sight. The Nephilim had no doubt his brother had the making of a hero, but he didn't mention that as the reason for being here. Wished to burden Blake with some expectation he might feel Lucian had for him. The silver-haired man hadn't lied though, he did hope for Blake to make a contract with an elemental. It's just that he hoped that elemental was a lord of light or darkness so as to grant his brother a hero's egg. But even should the teen not gain the notice of one of those, any elemental would be a great help to him. As Lucian had said, Gazeldwargo had a contract with an earth elemental, and none would call that man weak. We'll just have to wait and see what happens, I guess, Lucian thought as he turned the roasting meat over the fire that would be their meal that night. The next 2 days were spent searching for the entrance to the labyrinth. It was only after Blake lost his footing on some shifting earth and fell that they finally found it. Beneath some overgrown roots was a passageway that led deep into the grove ahead. After collecting themselves after the teens' fall, they followed the passage deeper in, eventually encountering a large stone with a strange engraving. The engraved stone was made in such a way as to act like a door in some, as if it was waiting to open for any who pushed hard enough. It looks like what I faintly remember, Lucian thought before turning to his brother-in-law. But this is it, right, Lucian? Blake asked, more in confirmation than any sort of doubt. The stone made it hard to doubt its significance, the intricate carvings and powerful aura made it so. Still, the teen wanted to make sure before anything. As a result of Lucian's stories and several adventure common sense lessons, he knew not to touch weird magic things if he didn't know what they did. At his brother's nod, though, Blake seemed to steel himself. Then, almost as one, the brothers pushed on the faux door and began to walk down the seemingly infinite hall that laid before them. Blake looked around at the hall they now traversed, having left the outside world behind in favor of a brand new environment. Instead of the tree roots and moss he had seen just before entering, there was now only a long singular hall. The hall had stone columns at even intervals, and it was strangely hard to see too far down either side of the hall. It was like a strange fog blocked even his stronger senses, making it appear hazy and unclear. If not for Lucian looking so calm next him, the warrior would have entered a combat stance at their strange new surroundings. However, he trusted Lucian to have reacted more strongly if they were in danger. He knew the Nephilim he called brother had far stronger sense than he did, even after his naming. After gaining the new last name of Brightheart, Blake had grown stronger indeed. Lucian had said he was now approaching the status of an incomplete saint, though not quite there yet. Beyond a raw power increase, though, Blake had received one other boon from his naming, a new skill. Though it was more accurate to call it an evolution of his skills. The naming had resulted in his skills Magic Sword Manifestation and Muty Sword Manifestation, combining and evolving into the unique skill, Magical Arms Maker. Arms Maker had all the abilities of the former two skills as well as some new abilities. New abilities included increasing the magical effects he could imbue into his swords to the equivalent of an extra skill in power, the ability to make multiple magic swords that were permanent, should he wish it, and the ability to analyze any magical weapon or item with the new analytical appraisal subskill to then recreate the effect whenever he wants for his own. All that was cool enough, but there were two more abilities that Blake saw even more potential in. One was a new subskill called Enchant. This allowed him to enchant any weapon with a magical effect that he could create for his summoned swords. That was neat on the surface. Sure, but what made Blake all the more interested in it was its less obvious application. Instead of using it to turn regular steel into magical weapons, what if he forged a powerful sword by hand made of incredible materials, then enchanted it? He imagined that would make for an even stronger weapon in the end. As for the other ability, it was less a new ability and more a lessening of a restriction. Could make things other than swords as long as they were a weapon. He'd tested this with making spears and axes, even bows and arrows. All of those were now capable of being made with the skill, though things like shields and armor were so far impossible. It seemed that Blake's skill was very clear when it came to what it considered a weapon or an arms. Wasn't a problem though, since now Blake could fully arm an army full of all kinds of troops single-handedly should he wish. Focusing more on the present situation though, Blake saw his brother seem to look around for something. At first the redhead wasn't sure what for, until he heard the laughter. "What do we have here? A duo of tough men barging into my home, is it?" A small childlike voice said in his head, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. The voice was teasing and needling, like a little girl dangling a secret in front of you or playing coy. It was a bit unnerving in a way, especially with the chorus of laughter that followed the words in a tittering manner coming from multiple voices. It was in times like this that he was glad Lucian was more unflappable than most, as the silver-haired man kept his calm, and remained a steady presence for the teen to latch onto. With how strange things were getting, he needed that. We did not come here to make a nuisance. No, we have come in order to seek an audience with the elemental Queen Ramiris, with hopes of allowing my companion here to enter the dwelling of the spirits to form a contract, Lucian said aloud in response to the strange voice, his tone clear, and holding no deception in it. The voice seemed to go quite at those words, not in any sort of surprise but more so in consideration of them. After a time the voice responded to Lucian's words. Very well, I can show you the way to the dwelling. However, I can't just let anyone who waltzes in go there, so first you must complete a test. Follow the path, if you dare, the female voice said at last, her last sentence punctuated by a giggle that undermined the threat a bit in Blake's opinion. Then before the two travelers a glowing path illuminated for them. Blake looked to his brother and Lucian gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze in response. Taking a deep breath he steeled himself for what was to come, and walked alongside his brother down the glowing. After a time that felt like forever, and all too soon all at once they made it to the end of. Once the glowing trail died off they found themselves in a large room that looked carved from stone that was bare of anything except for in the center. There in the heart of the room laid a giant metal behemoth roughly 1.5 times taller than Blake or Lucian. It was wide, looking like it was larger than two soldiers in full plate, stood shoulder to shoulder, and seemed to weigh more than Surtur in his giant form. Grown, the colossus came to life, its singular red eye glowing as magic flooded its systems from its activation. It was then that the voice spoke once more. If you can defeat my golem here, then I'll gladly show you the way, she said with a glee to her voice that made Blake feel like he should be concerned. Lucian smiled at those words before speaking up in response. So you're saying that as long as I can subdue this metal monster here, you'll show us to thee, is that a deal? He asked, the voice with a smirk in his words that made Blake more than believe the half-demon nature of his brother. If you can do that, then I'll do just that, she said, and the redhead couldn't help but smile at their new assurance. After what happened to the last and only person to have broken a deal with Lucian, he was reassured that they wouldn't be getting screwed over now. Once those words were said, though, it seemed that a signal had been given as the metal creature moved forth and seemed to prepare to attack. Lucian just kept smiling though, and held his arm out towards the thing. In a moment black shadow tendrils came forth and wrapped around the golem. Now held in place by shadowy bindings, Lucian walked up to the behemoth and touched it directly before a sudden blast of cold air came forth. The Nephilim had used his ice manipulation skill that he'd gotten so long ago, with the ice being reinforced with yang manipulation to strengthen. Once that was done, the silver-haired man relaxed and watched on as the metal golem struggled before ultimately failing to break free. Watching on, Blake couldn't help but feel his respect for his brother grow more. Mechanical monstrosity was strong after all, and Blake wasn't sure he would have done nearly as well against it. He figured he'd win, but to do so without destroying it was beyond his current abilities, he felt. It only cemented his belief in his brother though, and encouraged him to grow stronger to match such feats of power. It seemed though that the other party that was audience to Lucian's quick entrapment of the golem was not as odd. In a flash of light a small, blonde-haired pixie came forth and started to fly around like a drunk fly. Damn it, damn it, damn it. That was my best creation, and you just went and turned it into a frozen iceberg leg. The small flying pixie ranted until it seemed she bit her tongue midway through. Lucian took that moment to grab a hold of the small pixie, now holding her in his hands. Then that Blake got a better look at the small one. She was blonde like he had seen before, with her hair cut short, ironically in a pixie cut type. She wore a black strapless and sleeveless dress that went from her chest to her calves. Armbands going from the crook of her shoulder to her wrists were also present as part of her garb, white ones going from her knee to her ankles were worn as well. She was cute looking, like a character from a children's story brought to life in Blake's opinion. Though the next words made his jaw fall despite the tales that Lucian told him. How dare you grab me like this? Unhand me, I'm the queen of the fairs, dang it, and I demand respect. she shouted out while waving her arms around, sounding more like a whining child than any kind of queen. That statement made him look at her oddly, unbelieving of the pixie's words somewhat. "Hello to you too, Ramiris the elemental queen, and pixie of the labyrinth," Lucian said with a smirk while looking down at the small one in his hand. That made one thought enter Blake's mind. But she's so tiny. He thought incredulously as he watched on at his brother, almost bullying one of the most ancient demon lords. Edited, January 28, 2026. Chapter 38, Make 1, Non-Canon. The Bender. Blake wondered how exactly he found himself in this mess. First, a bit of context is in order. It all started after Shizu left through the warp gate to see her former student. After the kiss she gave Blake's brother, it seemed that Lucian had been a bit too embarrassed to do much. Then, after a few hours, they were all back at the inn and the redhead found the men mopping, for lack of a better word. It seemed that his brother was truly going to miss the black-haired swordswoman, and didn't know how to handle that. The good little brother that he was, Blake made a suggestion. "Let's drink tonight and forget your worries," was what he'd said a few hours earlier. Now, Blake watched on in a stunned kind of horror as his normally more composed brother drank his fourth drink of the night. Or, more accurately, his fourth barrel of the night. At first Lucian had been hesitant to start drinking, but Blake encouraged him to have a few. He'd heard from some of the older members of his village growing up that some would drink to forget their worrying over loved ones out on hunts or from missing those they lost. Figured it might help his Nephilim companion do the same. The first few drinks didn't seem to faze the man though, even with his resistance skills turned off in order to feel it. It turned out that even in his first life Blake's brother had a very high tolerance for booze, one that only seemed to have gotten better in his new life. So a few drinks didn't do anything to him. That was until he tasted something that was more to his liking. It had been a shot of some clear drink that the bartender at the higher-end place they were drinking at had said was made from potatoes. The redhead was confused on how such a vegetable could be used for alcohol, and it seemed to be a common reaction for most as the man was beginning to explain more about the strange liquid. At least until Lucian downed it without blinking before the barkeep could say more than two words. "That's some good vodka," Lucian exclaimed before ordering more. That soon turned to him asking for the barrel that it came from, and then 3 more in the span of a few hours. It was only due to his brother's non-human biology that Lucian wasn't dead. Blake knew that for damn sure. The mix of not being able to die from alcohol poisoning and processing anything he drank instantly had saved him. It hadn't stopped him from becoming more drunk than Blake thought was possible, for a human or not. Thus began Blake's foray into dealing with the extremely powerful toddler that was now his. At first it was funny to see Lucian make a mess of things and say random shit. He tried to fight the bartender when the shocked man tried to finally cut him off. The dark red flames he summoned didn't inspire much confidence after all. After that Blake had them leave the establishment in hopes of sobering his brother up. Somehow spiraled into them being chased by the city guards after Lucian used his darkness manipulation to give an armored knight a wedgie. Once they had lost those guys, Blake had stopped to catch his breath when Lucian started ranting. At first it seemed to be him waxing on about how much he missed Shizu, then it went into him cursing out someone named Leon. That soon went to him going on about time-traveling bullshit, and a bitch-ass demon lord who almost killed the same girl he'd been trying to. That was all concerning enough, but when he started to talk aloud to his skill while mentioning destructive yields, Blake got majorly concerned. That all culminated in Lucian opening a portal with his spatial skills, and walking through it before Blake could even think to stop him. Blake looked on at the spot where his brother had just stood. His now extremely impaired and highly powerful brother had vanished from God knows what. Out of a portal some 50 feet in the air, a silver-haired man fell out in a drunken manner. Catching himself in the air with his hastily deployed wings, he started to float in the air now. After orienting himself as best he could, the Nephilim looked down and saw just what he'd been aiming for, the City of Gold itself. This place just so happened to be the territory of Demon Lord Leon Cromwell, and he was about to get a little revenge. This is for Shizu, you bastard, Lucian shouted out in slurred words before launching a wobble orb of eclipse energy. Once the orb hit the nearby mountain, a gigantic explosion erupted forth that shook the Demon Lord's castle from its foundations. Lucian cackled at that and soon was bombarding the place with every destructive spell he had, while making sure not to aim for civilian areas. It was as he was unleashing his volley of destruction that he noticed some explosions not belonging to his attacks and a laugh that certainly wasn't his. Looking to his side, Lucian saw a blonde-haired, delinquent-looking girl that oozed power in the blonde gremlin was launching nuclear magic with no restraint and seemed to be taking a similar, if not greater pleasure in the nuisance she was being for the platinum saber than he was. The two of them stopped their attacks after she realized he was looking at her. For a moment. For a while the two just stared at one another, until the gremlin known as Juan spoke up. First one to make him come out wins, she asked with a grin that spoke to her love of destruction. You're on, was Lucian's reply before launching even more destruction at the castle. Inside the castle itself, Demon Lord Leon was sitting in a chair while massaging his forehead in frustration. His aide looked on in concern as he seemed to get progressively more and more annoyed as the cackling from outside got louder and louder. There can't seriously be two of them now. Can there, he said, with the last part coming out more as a whine or a divine plea than anything else. It was like that Lucian made friends with the primordial yellow over a night of annoying Demon Lord Leon Cromwell. He lost that bet though, but he swore he'd win the next. Blake's freakout when told what happened the next day was fully justified in the Redhead's edited, January 29, 2026 Chapter 39. Chapter 36. After catching the little pixie, Lucian waited for her to finish her rant before speaking. And I should be given more respect than this. She finished, only biting her tongue 3 more times in her ranting before huffing. The blonde pixie was pouting now, puffing out her cheeks, and all like a small child. Nephilim honestly found it kind of funny to see the Queen of the Elementals, and one of those given a task by Veldanava himself, act so childish and petulant. It made him smirk in bemusement. So now that you're done, how about holding up your end of the deal? I even made sure to keep your little action figure intact for you out of the goodness of my heart, he told Ramiris before letting her go. She floated in front of him after that and sighed at his words. She seemed to kick the air while mumbling something to herself before the Queen of the Labyrinth responded properly. All right, fine. I'll show you the path, she said with a whine in her voice and a small glare directed at him. A light like what led him and Blake to their current room appeared then on the ground, and they began to follow it. Though before they left, Lucian blasted a flame made with the concept of ice melting, to get rid of the frost covering the pixie's golem. That act made her stop glaring at least, and she began to follow them down the path she lit for them. Walked, it seemed the small one grew bored and decided to strike up a conversation. I'm a bit surprised that you knew who I was immediately. Few people recognize my greatness right away. Ramiris said to Lucian, her boasting not hiding her very real curiosity. Lucian hummed to himself at those words while deciding how to answer that statement. Well, I have heard of your cycle of reincarnation, and how it leaves you weakened for quite some time, until you can regain your full power. It made sense to me then that it would also make your race devolve in a way. So, with how you seem to control this place, and are connected to it, it wasn't hard to put it all together, the silver-haired man told her with a smile on his face. Blake looked on from the side with a shake of his head, having grown used to his brother doing things like this. The reincarnator had a penchant for putting things like that together. Lucian, unbeknownst to Blake, was good at doing so even without the additional information his situation afforded him. Part of that was his understanding of tropes mixed with a high level of observation, and another part was the use of an outsider's logic that was willing to accept anything even if it didn't prescribe to traditional sense. It was a short time after that filled with Ramiris making light conversation before they reached the dwelling of sprites. Neither begrudged the suddenly chatty fairy, she seemed pretty lonely after all. However, once they reached the dwelling she stopped her chatter, and became more serious in demeanor. Flying in front of them once more she looked at Blake, having been told he was the primary one they were there for. Now you must go forth onto the platform and call out to the spirits. Should any find you worthy, they shall answer your call, the queen told him, her cadence finally matching that title as she spoke those words. Lucian was a bit surprised at the suddenly serious Ramiris, not having expected that at all. From what he remembered when Rimuru came here with the child summons, the fairy was still playful with them all even when it came time for this part. If he were to guess though, it was because Blake wasn't a child. She is most likely being more serious due to his maturity, thus knowing he is more capable of the respect the spirits deserve than a child like the students, Lucian thought to himself as he gave his brother a comforting squeeze of his shoulder. Blake steeled himself, burying his nerves like he did before heading off to the battlefield. With firm steps he walked the remainder of the path to the glowing platform that looked just as Lucian remembered from the anime. Once he reached the center of the platform he took one more stealing breath before doing something the Nephilim had not expected. Seemed to burst forth. In a wave of energy Blake seemed to release his aura, his hockey, and perhaps his very soul. Forth for all in the chamber to see. It was as if he was bearing himself, body, mind and soul, for any to judge should they dare. Lucian had told the teen that the spirits would judge him, and look into who he was at his core, and it seemed that Blake took those words to heart. Redhead refused to hide any part of himself from them, letting any prospective elementals see all of him. The warrior shouted out, putting his all into presenting himself to the spirits. It was a few moments later that the aura died down, and Blake seemed to try and catch his. At first no one showed up, not even motes of light that represented lesser spirits. Was until in a burst of power 2 elementals of incredible power came forth into being. One on the right is shown with a brilliant white light, possessing a humanoid female face and 12 white dove-like wings. She was garbed in a white dress that concealed all of herself but her hands, her golden blonde hair the only true spot of color in her entire being. Next to her on the left was someone who looked her complete opposite. He posed the head of a raven with black wings to match coming from his back. A black pair of pants were all he wore, showing off his ebony-skinned torso. The cloth of his pants looked as if cut from the reaper's cloth, or like a shadow had been turned to silk and sewn for his use. From both of them an oppressive aura came forth, being some of the strongest ones Lucian had seen up to this point. Even without Ramiris' words he would have been able to tell who, or more what, these two were. Elemental lords of light and darkness. The queen said in awe at seeing both come forth at once and for the same man. You sure surpassed any hopes I had, brother, Lucian thought with a savage smirk of joy at the development. Blake hadn't been certain about his plan up to this point. After hearing how the elementals would judge him worthy or not, he decided to not hide in any way. If they were going to judge him then they should see all of him, should they not? That was his thinking at least. Once he finished bearing his soul he had initially thought it all for naught. Then these two showed up out of nowhere. You who is connected to the Lord of Balance, we have judged you worthy. We are the twin lords of light and darkness, and we shall grant you our power. Come forth and let us grant you the blessing of heroes. May you hatch the egg and carve your name into the annals of time. They spoke in unison before diving into him. As the two lords of contrasting elements crashed into him, and placed him on his knees, Blake felt power grow inside of him. Power that he never thought he would possess. Alongside the growing strength in his body and soul, he felt a thread connecting his soul grow stronger. Was a thread that had appeared after Lucian named him, something he felt and cherished since gaining it. Now it was growing stronger, like he was more aligned with his brother in a way beyond what he could understand. It made him incredibly happy to feel that, to have the metaphysical bond between them strengthen. Blake also felt himself change on a soul level, almost like he was evolving but not quite. Knew instinctively that he was now what Lucian referred to as an incomplete saint, and the difference in power between that and an enlightened was greater than he ever expected. That all wasn't enough. After he finally felt the energies of the two elementals calm down and regained his feet, the queen herself came before him. You have been given the blessing of two elemental lords, one of darkness and one of This is unprecedented, but my duty remains the same, she said, confusing him greatly before she placed a kiss on his forehead. He would have been baffled at that action, had he not immediately fallen once more to his knees as something was engraved into his soul. No, that wasn't quite right. It was as if something was not attached to his soul, waiting for the time in which it can fully become a part of him. That time wasn't now, but Blake could still see what it was. Well, as much as one could see when it came to things like this, he supposed. It was an orb, almost oblong in shape. The strange thing looked to be made of a swirl of black and white, light and shadow. Engraved upon its surface was one word, hero. All he could read, all he could experience, before the realm of dreams called him in a way that he could no longer deny. It was a day later, and Blake had yet to wake. Lucian was concerned, even with Puriel's assurances that his brother was fine. From what the ultimate skill could tell through the analysis done using the soul corridor that now exited between them, Blake's soul had rapidly changed, and was given a massive influx of energy. This resulted in his body not quite being capable of keeping up with the change, and thus entered a rest state as a result. From what the angelic skill told him, the redhead should awaken by this time tomorrow, thankfully. Just to help assuage his worries, however little it actually did so, he'd asked Ramiris about his brother's state. The pixie had replied that it was likely too much for Blake to handle, and he passed out from the incredible change that took place within him. Apparently, gaining a hero's egg is incredibly taxing in most cases, but is not something that usually results in such a few different factors play a part in this, including one crucial one. The closer the recipient is to meeting the conditions to hatch the egg, the more intense the strain. That was likely due to how the closer one was to hatching the egg, the more changes needed to occur in a shorter period of time. While the less close someone was to doing so, required less immediate changes, and instead they could be done over time. It was incredibly interesting, he wouldn't lie, and if it wasn't making him worry about his brother so much, Lucian would have been far more excited to find this all out. As it was, it merely made him more concerned. The fact that Ramiris said that the presence of two elemental lords forming his egg made it more straining was even more worrying to him. The Queen had said that such an event had never occurred before as well. Normally, only one elemental lord of light, darkness, or time would appear at once and bless someone. None of the three like to share, nor can they normally exist in the same. Those two, however, I believe, are a rare exception to the rules, and have been looking for another exception like themselves. If their words are to be believed, then they may in fact be the twins from the dawn, Ramiris had told him when he asked more about what had the twins. He'd asked the fairy in curiosity. She seemed to puff up at his question, glad to have known something he didn't. The twin elemental lords of light and darkness, two sprites that came into being simultaneously shortly after the dawn of creation, after the first angels and demons were formed from the holy spirits. They are some of the oldest elementals in existence and near inseparable, though none have seen them in millennia. She told him the abbreviated history of the two. That made Lucian think for a bit before asking his next question. Does that mean they're like the elemental equivalents of the primordial demons and the seven angels of origin? He asked, eyes nearly bulging out of his head at the pixie's nod. You're really well informed, huh? The labyrinth ruler said in response. For the rest of the day after that, Lucian sat back and just processed that bombshell. Knowledge that there could exist primordial equivalents for elementals through him for a however, after thinking back on it more, it made sense to him. Angels, demons, and elementals have always been grouped together. They form a sort of trinity of sorts, each equal in a way. So if the angels have their seven of origin, and the demons have the primordials, then why wouldn't the elementals have something similar? Had concluded in the end. In a way, it was another part of this world that existed to balance out the scales of things. Demons had come into existence to balance out the creation of the angels without Veldanava making it happen on purpose. So, with that in mind, it was clear that something back then had been making sure to balance the world out. That idea made something resonate in Lucian's being, the idea of balance speaking to him in a way that he didn't expect. The next day, close to when Blake should be waking up, Lucian decided to ask their host something. He'd been fascinated at the small world skill, and wanted information on it since, but he knew he wouldn't be given such a thing for free. So he'd been thinking about what he could offer the Queen of the Elementals for such a thing, and he finally found it. Once Puriel ran the calculations and said it was possible, he went to the Queen in question with a question on his lips. "Hey Ramiris, do you want to make a deal?" he asked her, a devilish grin on his face that made her gulp. After Lucian explained how his skill soul bargain worked, and he told her what he wanted, Ramiris had one question. "And what is it you're offering me in exchange for this?" she asked, channeling the scant memories of her past more regal self to show her seriousness. She knew she wasn't like she had been all those years ago. Ramiris was weaker, less regal, and less like she'd been so long ago. Each reincarnation made the memories more and more faint, less like they belonged to her. Sometime, when she was lost in a new batch of memories her growing self acquired, she'd wonder if she could even be called Ramiris. Each new iteration of her was different in some way, sometimes barely so, and others more clearly different. It weighed on her at times, despite her immaturity. So when she heard Lucane's next words she was speechless for some time. "How would you like the removal of your curse, and an end to your endless cycle of rebirth?" he said with a charm and carefreeness that didn't belong to someone offering the impossible. Like he was. It took a solid 5 minutes for her to gather her chaotic thoughts enough to speak, and even then only a single word. She screamed out in shock at that bold offer. Lucian smiled at her more gently at that before explaining. "I possess another unique skill called Essence of Flame. It allows me to make flames with any property that I want as long as I can supply the energy needed. That includes a flame that could burn away your curse, so you may regain all you have lost. It will be quite costly for me though, but information about your small world skill is plenty worth it," he told her calmly, letting her come to terms with that knowledge. She nodded eventually, knowing how important this was. If he could do this, and his skill shouldn't let him make deals he can't uphold from the sounds of it, then this was too much of an important opportunity to pass up. So what if he gained information about her ultimate skill? Even if he recreated it, this would be worth it. To have the world finally have a true Queen of Spirits for more than a few decades every 1,000 years or so was worth it. "Very well then," she said hesitantly as she held out her hand to him, "we have a deal." After shaking her hand, Lucian was covered in brilliant white flames that felt as pure as an elemental lord of light to her. The flames slowly moved from him to where their hands met and encroached onto her. White flames touched her, and despite feeling the heat she didn't burn or hurt. No, instead it felt like something vile and corruptive was finally leaving her. Like a pain she never noticed since she'd lived with it so long finally was fading. Bit by bit, Ramiris felt as the flames burned away the corruption Guy and Malim's magicules had inflicted on her all those years ago. As it left her she noticed her power start to increase, and her memories become clearer. Soon, all her memories from each life she'd lived were crystal clear to her, and a sense of being flooded her. She knew then that this man hadn't lied to her, and that she owed him a great debt. For now she could say with confidence and certainty, she was Ramiris, Queen of the Elementals and Spirits, ruler of the elemental realm. And a queen paid their debts. Edited, January 29, 2026. Chapter 40, Chapter 37. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. As the flames of purification finally abated, they left an interesting sight in their wake. Where the small pixie once floated was what looked like a small girl of 8 or 9. Blonde and had her hair in the same pixie cut as before, her outfit being merely a sized-up version of what she had worn previously. Lucian was a bit surprised at the new appearance of the fairy queen, having expected her to return to her fully adult form right away. Did it not work? He mused out loud in confusion only to receive a laugh from the small. It worked, you silly. It will simply take some time before all my energy returns to me once. This form is what I would have come to look like in a few centuries, evolving from a pixie into a lesser fairy. In time I shall evolve into a greater fairy, and eventually my previous peak as a royal fairy, she said, her voice remaining remarkably similar to what she'd sounded like in her tiny form. Lucian looked at her consideringly at that before asking his question. "How long will that take, Ramiris?" he asked in curiosity at the timetable this change was working with. Ramiris hummed to herself and placed a hand on her chin at that, seeming to run some kind of calculation in her head. "About 2 or 3 decades, I think. That is far better than the several centuries it would normally be, and this time it'll be permanent, so I'd say this was a massive success." Shouted out at the end, excitement bursting from her at the fact she was whole again. Lucian smiled at the small one, glad to see her so content with the outcome that came to be. Burning away her curse, so to speak, was not an easy endeavor by any means. It had taken all of the souls from the troll general turned into raw power to fuel that flame, and it just barely covered it. Now, in the aftermath of using such power, his vessel was somewhat strained, and he decided to hold off on using magic for the next day or so to let it recover. The silver-haired man did think it might be somewhat of a problem that she wouldn't regain her full power in time for the war, though. It was then that an idea struck him. "Would you regain your power faster if you were given a second name?" he asked, knowing she didn't possess one. The fairy looked at him for a moment before laughing in his face. "Well, it would certainly do that, but you are far too weak to name someone like me as you are now. Anything short of divinity would fail to do so, even in my current state," the queen explained to him in a teasing manner, finding it quite funny that he even suggested that he smiled a bit self-deprecatingly at those words, knowing he'd been getting ahead of himself with that one. Ramiris wasn't an existence that could be named in any meaningful way by just she was a being of ancient power, a ruler of an entire dimension, and was connected to the great holy spirits that have existed since the dawn of creation. To name her, even when lessened like she was now, would require an incredible amount of magicules to say the least. So, with all that in mind, Lucian decided to drop it after that for now. Just as that had been settled, stirring from Blake drew both their attention. The redhead rose groggily from where he'd been laid down on his coat courtesy of Lucian. Rubbing his eyes, he looked around in slight confusion that cleared up when he saw his brother standing not far from where he laid. That confusion immediately returned when he saw the small, child-sized Ramiris standing next to his older brother. Tilting his head to the side, Blake blurted out the first thing that came to his mind in that moment. "Did the shorty hit a growth spurt while I was out or something?" he asked, and as soon as those words left his mouth an aura of great fury came from said shorty. The queen of the elementals, chosen worker of Veldanava the creator god, threw her shoe at the teen, at that comment in her frustration. "I'm fun-sized, damn it," she shouted out as she proceeded to whack the boy upside the head as best she could, only being able to reach due to his laid-down position. Lucian just shook his head at the sight, completely ignoring the pleading look his brother. It was a few hours later, and after Lucian explained everything to Blake, they decided to use a room that Ramiris provided for them to test his new abilities. As Blake tested out all that he'd gained, Lucian talked with Puriel on the information gained through their deal with the fairy. After a bit, Lucian was able to understand that he now had enough information to recreate the skill small world in the capacity of a unique skill currently, not yet at the same level as the normally he'd ask his angelic ultimate skill to make it immediately, but there was a simply put, he didn't have the power to do so. From what Puriel estimated, it would take almost 5,000 souls worth of power to make even this lessened version of the skill. That was an absurd amount of power that he simply didn't have right now. Even after his harvest festival, he may not be able to make it. Makes sense though, small world was broken as hell. The ability to create your own dimension in which you're essentially God was an incredible ability. The dungeon from Canon came to his mind when thinking on just what the limits of this skill were. The thing that made it all the crazier to him was that the 100-floor dungeon was made by a weakened Ramiris. Now that she was going to regain her full power in time, there was no telling what her limits are with the skill now. So even a lesser form of the skill Lucian knew would be invaluable in time. It was only a matter of gaining the power to make it. Putting that aside though, Lucian focused on his brother now. It seemed that due to gaining an elemental lord of both light and darkness, that Blake now had the extra skills darkness domination and light domination. Why he had access to such skills and other hero candidates didn't, he wasn't sure, but the Nephilim thought it may have been due to the connection that existed between them. After gaining the hero's egg, Blake's connection to him had grown stronger, almost as if the string connecting them had thickened into a proper, but that wasn't all the teen had gained. Blake was faster, stronger, and more durable to a noticeable degree. His stamina, already something beyond exceptional, now seemed boundless. That was proven when he used his unique Sil magical arms maker to create 40 magical weapons, and took telekinetic control of them all. That had resulted in what looked like a tornado of blades surrounding him, cutting all around him with flashes of the elements. To be honest, Lucian was a bit intimidated at the sight, even more so at how unbothered he was after using such a move. If that wasn't enough, what happened once the teen finally decided to stop for a break made it clear that Blake had gained an incredible amount from coming here. Once he sat down, too. Voices spoke up, two familiar voices. "That was a good showing, boy," a masculine voice said from Blake's left. "Yes, it certainly was," a more feminine voice said from the redhead's right. Both Blake and Lucian looked around for the voice's location, soon finding it when in a flash of dark and bright light respectively 2 figures appeared on Blake's shoulders. Flash died down. There was now a bird on each shoulder of the teen. The right shoulder had a white dove perched on it, with the left having a raven with pitch-black feathers perched on it. First both the humanoids looked at them in bafflement before Blake put it. "Are you two the ones who blessed me?" he asked, having not expected this to happen. "Yes, my child. We are the twin elemental lords who have given you the blessing that had become a hero's egg," the pure white dove said, though from the lack of beak movement it seemed to more so be a thought communication than proper speech. Lucian was confused in the extreme. Normally, the elemental was supposed to become the hero's egg essentially. That made it nearly impossible for them to come back out and act like a summoned elemental. After voicing this confusion to the two, and the bird-like elementals seeming to ask Blake if it was okay to answer, the raven spoke up to explain. "In normal circumstances, you'd be right. However, the presence of the two of us have resulted in a special circumstance. We each have given up much of our power to form the egg, but due to there being 2 of us, a scant amount of power for each of us was left over. This has allowed us to exist outside of the egg without any detrimental side effects, although we are now both barely on par with a medium elemental in power," he explained in a smooth, baritone voice. Blake was happy with that result, glad to now have 2 new companions to aid him in battle like he'd hoped for. Lucian was happy for his brother and understood the explanation of the darkness elemental well enough. In the end, it was only another way for his brother to protect himself, and that was all he cared about. Though it did kind of stink that they had become so weakened as a result. It seemed that Blake was of a similar mind and remembered how Lucian told him about offering to name Ramiris to help her regain her power since he decided to make this offer. "Would you both become stronger if I named you too?" he asked the 2 bird-like elementals. The 2 former lords looked at each other, seeming to be in silent communication. Some consideration, the 2 seemed to come to a decision on the matter. It was the dove-like one of the pair that spoke this time. "If that is your wish, we will not reject a name from our new partner. We only warn you of the toll such an endeavor could place on you, young one," and she said to him, warning him of the possibility of negative consequences for doing as he offered. It was then that Lucian pipped up in response to that. "There's no need to worry about that. Should Blake not possess enough power to safely name the 2 of you, I shall transfer some of my own power through our soul corridor to help make the difference," the Nephilim told them, getting a grateful look from his brother at that assurance. Taking a deep breath, Blake thought hard on what to name the 2 bird-looking elementals that were now his partners. He thought back on his life, trying to recall anything that could inspire him. His thoughts took him back to a late night spent talking with Shizu. Oddly, she spoke of how her native language was far different from the one in this world, of how she rarely spoke it anymore after learning the tongue of this world in order to speak with others before she gained the magic sense skill. When he'd asked her what her language had been like, and if she could teach him some of it, she seemed so happy and agreed to do so. Thinking back on that time made him smile, How Lucian heard them going over the basic words of the Japanese language and joined in due to his own curiosity. That was a fond memory for the teen, a bonding moment that made him feel a part of the family that his brother was slowly forming around them. It was while remembering this lesson from Shizu that 2 words he'd learned of her language came to mind. They had seemed like such beautiful and cool words, their meanings drawing his attention. Now they would serve well for this, he felt. You, Blake turned to the dove first, shall be Hikari. A glow engulfed the now named Hikari, and as she slowly grew in power the hero candidate turned to the raven on his other shoulder. And you shall be Yami, he said, and the raven glowed in a similar light to their light counterpart. In a burst of light the 2 birds no longer stayed on Blake's shoulders, having hopped down mid-evolution. That was a good thing, as now they had grown into birds roughly the size that Suzaku had been when Lucian had first summoned him. Now as big as hounds, the 2 looked mighty fierce, talons looking to have been carved from ivory and onyx respectively sharp and dangerous. They were fully capable of fighting now. Yami seemed to ruffle his feathers before inspecting his new talons, then carved into the floor despite Ramra's protest to test them. In contrast, Hikari straightened up and took to flying a small circle around her human partner, testing her new size and how it let her fly. We thank you, partner, the 2 spoke in unison once Hikari landed before turning into motes of white and black light and returning to rest within their chosen partner. Once they did so, Blake fell on his rear, exhausted from naming the 2 elementals. Had needed to supply him with a bit of power in order to not have any risk of adverse effects, but not nearly as much as the Nephilim had thought he might have needed to. That had been a pleasant surprise at least. Well, congratulations, Blake. You've done your first naming, Lucian exclaimed and patted his brother on the back. From the middle finger the redhead gave him in return, Lucian figured his jest was taken. Quite the chuckle the teen gave before passing out made it certain. After Blake woke up again, Lucian decided it was time to have a chat. He called the teen before he could go off back to training, and asked him to take a seat. Thankfully Ramiris had agreed to make a table and chairs for them after he bribed her with some sweets he had, and she may be more mature now that her memories were back, but she still had a strong sweet tooth. Regardless, he sat Blake down and looked at him with the face he knew signaled to those who knew him that what he was about to talk about was serious. From the redhead's unconscious straightening of his spine it seemed to have worked. Blake, I think it's time I told you more of my plans for after the Harvest Festival, Lucian said with complete seriousness, voice heavy with a weight that the teen didn't often hear in the man's voice. Blake gulped a bit before answering that statement. Very well, I can't say I'm not curious about these plans, he said, getting a nod from his brother before he went on to explain. First off, I will preface this with explaining my thought process. In the ensuing conflict I will kill the new king of Malstance, that is certain. With him not possessing an heir the nation will enter a time of turmoil. War is likely to break out as every noble begins to fight for the throne or carve out their own new kingdoms in the chaos. This will certainly result in mass casualties, from the soldier and common folk alike. This is all without mentioning how the surrounding nations will respond to the instability that will follow, the silver-haired man explained to the teen. The hero candidate nodded at the explanation from his brother, sad to hear that such was likely, but having expected something like that to occur after the conflict. Lucian continued at the fact that such a situation will come about due to my actions does not sit well with me. As such, I plan to back a candidate for the throne and aid in establishing stability in the. It is only right that I do so to ensure the safety of the common people, for to involve them in the problems their king and nobles caused is unfair. With my new position as a demon lord, of which I have a plan to cement myself as one with great authority, the chance that the one I back would be refused is incredibly small, he told the teen, getting a questioning look in return. The teen then spoke his question at the Nephilim's prompting. Why don't you take the throne then? You would be a great leader, he said, full sincerity in his words as he completely believed in his brother's ability to rule. Lucian sighed at that, not in annoyance or anything but merely at the way of the world. Such a thing is impossible. For a monster, a demon lord at that, to rule over a human nation is unthinkable. The people of the nation would be easily galvanized and radicalized to fight against me, the Holy Church likely aiding in such a thing as well. That's just the internal problems that would arise. The truth is that the surrounding nation in the Council of the West would take issue as well. At that point I'd be facing both a civil war and an invasion from the neighboring counties, and my attempts to limit casualties would be completely overturned and pointless, Lucian explained to the teen, getting a disheartened look from him at those words. Blake wished he could refute those words, but knew the logic was sound. It wouldn't matter. How good or fair a ruler his brother would be, the humans would not be able to see past their prejudice. At least, not before it was too late, and a mountain of bodies was left in the ensuing. Taking a breath, Blake asked his next question. All right, I understand that. Who do you plan on backing as the new king? He asked his brother, wishing to know who his brother believed was capable for this important task. Noctis or Luke could be good, he thought. Richard even more so, despite his commoner background posing a possible issue. While he waited to hear the name from his brother's lips, all he got was silence. Looking at Lucian in the face once more after separating himself from his thoughts, Blake saw the look on his brother's face. It was simply a raised eyebrow in his direction, as if Blake should know who he meant. It took a moment before the redhead put it together, and when he did it was quite clear his reaction. He shouted out, not appreciating his brother's laughter at his completely justified surprise. Edited, January 29, 2026. Chapter and notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early, as well as access to a Discord as well. Patreon/random note. After you remove the spaces, don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.